The student went for an interview and disappeared without a trace. The next morning her body was found in a field and the police began searching for those responsible. From the first days of the investigation, there were many confusing moments and unexpected twists. But in the end, the truth was revealed. In this video, we will tell you what happened to Megan Sharpton. Megan Sharpton was born on October 24, 1987, in the small American town of Tullahoma, Tennessee. She grew up in a large and friendly family, with 2 sisters and a brother with whom she got along very well. Her parents tried to give maximum attention to all their children, but Megan was closest to her mother. From an early age, the young woman helped her parents take care of her younger siblings. She also always tried to help her friends and loved ones. In her school years, Megan decided she wanted to become a nurse. So she enrolled in the local Motlow College, which was 10 kilometers from her home. The young woman also got a job as a waitress in a local restaurant and eventually moved in with her boyfriend, Chris. In the summer of 2012, when Megan was 24 years old, she had only a few months left before finishing college. After that, she planned to immediately find a job as a nurse. Shortly before this, she also got a job at a nursing home to gain practical skills in helping the elderly. Despite such an intense rhythm of life, Megan tried to see her family whenever possible. On July 1st, her sister, who lived in another city, came home and Megan promised to meet with her. However, that evening, the young woman called her mother and said that she would be delayed. She was offered an interesting job opportunity, and Megan agreed to an interview that same evening. She was happy for this opportunity and promised her mother to come as soon as the interview was over. According to her, the job involved taking care of an elderly woman. However, time passed and there was no news for Megan. She did not respond to messages or calls. Her parents began to worry. They contacted her boyfriend. But he also did not know where Megan was and was not even aware of the interview. Despite this, the parents decided not to panic and wait for their daughter to get in touch. She was already 24 years old, and with her busy schedule, between studying and 2 jobs, the young woman could simply be busy. But the next day, Megan still did not show up. Meanwhile, in a remote area several kilometers from the city, at around 1:30 a.m., a group of teenagers noticed a fire in a field. It was a hot summer, so they thought that the forest fires had spread to the grass. They immediately called the firefighters, who arrived at the scene. However, an unexpected turn of events awaited them. Soon after the firefighters began extinguishing the flames, they saw a body laying in the center of the fire. When the fire was completely extinguished and the police arrived at the scene, they realized that a dead young woman lay before them. They immediately understood that a murder had been committed. However, the detectives could not establish the identity of the deceased. She had no documents, wallet, or phone with her, and due to the fire's effects, she could not be identified. The only thing that the detectives could grasp was 2 small star-shaped tattoos. The detectives studied the crime scene and concluded that the young woman was already dead before the fire started. This was evidenced by a serious head injury, which apparently was fatal, but they could not find any traces of the killer's presence. The victim was partially undressed, but from her t-shirt the police concluded that she worked as a nurse. They also determined that they had not received any reports of missing persons related to this young woman, which also complicated establishing her identity. However, soon after the information spread throughout the small town, her mother saw a post on social media about a young woman with 2 star-shaped tattoos being found in the field at night and realized with horror that her daughter was the victim. Medical experts ultimately confirmed that she was indeed Megan Sharpton. They also found that the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the back of the head, confirming the police version that the young woman was already dead at the time of the fire. Moreover, she was killed in another location and then taken to that field. In addition, she was subjected to violence before her death, and the experts were able to extract a DNA sample from the perpetrator. It was immediately run through the database. There were no matches. First, the detectives began searching for Megan's car, a red Mustang. She had been working at a restaurant that evening and left in her car, but it was nowhere to be found. This indicated that the killer most likely drove it somewhere where they could find substantial evidence. However, its location remained unknown and the police started searching for potential suspects among Megan's acquaintances. Their first focus was on her boyfriend, Chris, and the detectives had a significant reason to investigate him. Megan's sister immediately told them that she suspected Chris's involvement in the murder because there had been problems in their relationship. Megan had been dating Chris for 3 years, some of which they had lived together. They shared an apartment with another roommate and the police spoke with Chris, who denied any involvement in the crime. At first, he claimed that everything was fine between him and Megan, but eventually admitted that their relationship had been struggling lately and they were heading for a breakup. He insisted, however, that he had no motive for the murder and had a solid alibi at the time of her death. While the police checked his alibi, they decided to search the apartment where Megan and Chris lived. In the bathroom, they found the first alarming clue: blood stains and needles containing illegal substances. At the same time, 20 kilometers outside the city, detectives found her car. It had been abandoned in a remote, deserted location. Inside there were no documents or phones, which meant that the perpetrator might have taken or thrown them away elsewhere. The police reached out to the public, asking people to report anything similar they might find. Additionally, there was no signs of struggle or blood in the car, but they found something interesting: a note with an address that didn't exist. The detectives concluded that the unknown criminal had used this address to lure Megan to a deserted place to commit the crime. From the first hours of the investigation, detectives learned that the evening of the crime, Megan was supposed to go for an interview. But they had absolutely no leads in that direction. They believed that the non-existent address was given to her by the person who offered her the job. When the public learned the details of the case, many drew a chilling parallel. 6 months ago, another young woman of roughly the same age as Megan, who was also studying to become a nurse, disappeared without a trace several hundred kilometers from Tullahoma. What was even more terrifying was that this coincidence led everyone to believe that a serial killer was at work in the area, fueling the atmosphere of fear that the perpetrator would strike again. Meanwhile, the police questioned the couple's neighbor, who admitted to taking illegal substances. The neighbor claimed that Megan and Chris did not know about this and never indulged in it themselves. That they did indeed belong to the neighbor, but his story didn't end there. He claimed that Megan and Chris had actually broken up a long time ago, and he had started seeing her recently. The neighbor also insisted that he had been hiding his addiction from her. With this information, the police began to suspect both Chris and the neighbor. Chris could have held a grudge against Megan, and the neighbor had a penchant for illegal substances. There was no evidence against them. During his interrogation, Chris stated that he didn't know about the relationship, and by that time, the police had already verified his alibi. At the time of Megan's murder, he was indeed at work, so they ruled him out as a suspect. As for the neighbor, he didn't have a solid alibi, but analyzing his phone records revealed that he had been trying to call and message Megan all night, in an attempt to find out where she had gone. Although this was not substantial evidence of his innocence, the police doubted that he was the killer. Both of the guys had their DNA samples taken and sent to the lab, but the results could take months to come back. Meanwhile, the detectives had a new lead. Chris had offered to help with the investigation during his last interrogation, which was at home, and said he wanted to talk to her about a caregiver job and that Naomi had recommended her. Chris added that Megan had mentioned a young woman with that name who went to college with her, but he didn't know any details. So the police started looking for her among Matlow's students and soon found her. She was the only student with that name, and the detectives got her address, but she wasn't home. They talked to her neighbors and one of them gave them Naomi's phone number. She was surprised by the police call and said she barely knew Megan. They had a few classes together but didn't talk much, and she never recommended her for a job. In fact, she added that Megan annoyed her so she wouldn't have helped her. The police were disappointed that this promising lead didn't lead anywhere, but they still had something more substantial. Chris gave them the phone on which the job call had come in, and the detectives had the caller's number. Experts determined that the call was made from a prepaid phone, so it was impossible to identify the owner's name. But the police traced the device to the store where it was sold, and there was a surveillance camera at the checkout. By studying the footage on the day of the phone purchase, they immediately saw the buyer. From these shots, the police immediately realized that he was buying the phone for some illegal purposes. Prepaid phones in America are in demand among those involved in criminal cases, as they do not need to provide their data to use them. And this person on the recording at some point took out his own phone from his pocket, indicating that he was buying an additional one for some questionable purposes. There was also a camera in the store, pointing at the parking lot. The police saw the buyer leave the building and get into his car, which soon led to the identification of his identity. It turned out to be Timothy Gifford, who had an impressive criminal history. However, the man only engaged in petty trade of illegal substances and was not involved in anything serious. He was soon tracked down and taken to the police station. He claimed that he had purchased the phone not for himself, but for his acquaintance, a 37-year-old man named Donnie Jones. He said that Donnie was going to have an operation and he himself would not be able to go for the phone. As payment for this service, Donnie gave Timothy several illegal pills. Detectives were familiar with this man. He also had an impressive criminal history, but often acted as a police informant. Until Timothy revealed something else. Donnie wrote to him that he wanted to exchange his pickup truck for a Mustang and ask for help with this. Timothy considered this request quite strange, as Donnie had 2 small children and the Mustang was far from the most convenient family car. However, he agreed to try to find a client. Donnie handed him the pickup truck and he noticed that there was brand new carpets and seat covers in the interior of the rather old car. Donnie explained this by saying that his wife had told him that the chances of selling the car with a refreshed interior were much higher, and here the police suddenly discovered something that shocked them and glued all these parts to the store together. Donnie Frank turned out to be the husband of Naomi, who supposedly recommended the job to Megan. At this point, the detectives realized that they were getting close to solving the case. Unfortunately for them, the man's DNA sample was not in the database, as he had not been charged with violent crimes. They immediately went to Donnie and Naomi's house to talk to them. At first, the man claimed that he was not familiar with Megan, but within a few minutes he said that he had given her and Naomi a ride to college a few times. This seemed strange against the backdrop of Naomi's testimony a few weeks earlier. Then she claimed that she barely knew Megan and they hardly spoke and did not get along in general. However, during the subsequent conversation, the woman did say that her husband had indeed given them a ride once. However, Donnie firmly insisted on his innocence. According to his words, on the evening of the murder, he was at home with his children. He allowed the police to search his house without a warrant and voluntarily provided his DNA sample. In addition, he denied asking Timothy to buy a prepaid phone for him. The police found no evidence in his house and they had to wait for the DNA test results, which could also take months. 2 months had passed since the murder. People hoped that the police would catch the ruthless monster who could kill someone else at any moment. Eventually, the lab results showed a complete match between Donnie's DNA sample and the one found in Megan's body. He was immediately brought to the station, but he continued to insist on his innocence. Upon learning about the DNA match, he changed his story and told the detectives that he had a secret affair with Megan, which he did not tell his wife about. This was supposedly the reason why he did not reveal this information initially. The police considered his story an obvious fabrication, but they had to release him. Besides DNA, they had no other connecting evidence, and finding a 100% refutation of Donnie's words was simply impossible. Thus, the detectives were almost certain that Donnie was the killer, but they needed more evidence. Although they could not charge him with murder, they still managed to arrest him. During a search of his car, they found a firearm that he was not allowed to possess due to his criminal record. While he was in custody, the police had time to search for additional evidence. They did not have to worry about Donnie attacking someone else or running away. Soon, experts determined that Megan was shot with a firearm of the same caliber as Donnie's rifle. Detectives obtained a warrant to track his phone to see his movements on the evening of Megan's murder. They compared this data with the movements of the prepaid phone that Donnie allegedly never owned, and here the police waited for a long-awaited breakthrough. On the evening of July 1st, the prepaid phone was next to Donnie's phone and was moving along the same route. Detectives identified several key locations: Megan's presumed abduction site, the location where she was killed, and the field where her body was found. Both phones were found together at all these points. Donnie's family owned several farms in the Tullahoma area, and according to the investigation, he brought Megan to one of them after kidnapping her, where he assaulted and killed her. Detectives obtained a search warrant and found a significant piece of evidence: a partially burned scarf that belonged to Megan, which was a gift from her sister. This evidence, combined with Megan's belongings and DNA found at the scene, was sufficient to send the case to trial. On November 5, Donnie was charged with murder. During the trial, new details emerged that only strengthened the case against Donnie. Experts examined his phone and discovered that he had repeatedly contacted other young offering them jobs as caretakers for elderly people. But all of these attempts were unsuccessful. According to the investigation, Donnie found Megan's phone number on his wife's contact list, contacted her and said that Naomi had recommended her for the caretaking job. She agreed and he gave her a fake address, luring her to a remote location. There he attacked her, took her to the farm, where he assaulted and killed her. He then took her body to a field and set it on fire. The final touch was a complete replacement of the floor mats and seat covers in his pickup truck, which he used to transport her body. Apparently, he was afraid that some blood stains might be difficult to clean and the police would be able to detect them. As for Naomi, the police concluded that she had nothing to do with the murder and had no knowledge of it. She was at work that night, which was confirmed by numerous pieces of evidence. During the trial, Donnie claimed his innocence and everyone was preparing for a potentially lengthy process. However, when he realized that the prosecution was seeking the death penalty, he decided to make a deal with the investigation. He would admit guilt in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to the murder of Megan and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, he later claimed that he had only made the deal under pressure and demanded a retrial. When the judge granted his request, the man quickly returned to his original decision to plead guilty, as the death penalty was back on the table during the retrial. During the court proceedings, it was also explained why the criminal voluntarily provided detectives with his DNA sample, without any doubt. Apparently, he hoped that the fire would destroy all traces and the police would simply have nothing to compare a sample to. But he was wrong. Despite this, investigators concluded that Donnie was highly unlikely to be involved in the disappearance of another student who disappeared 6 months before Megan. More suitable suspects appeared in that case, and Donnie's candidacy was no longer considered. After the verdict was announced, Megan's sister stated that the criminal would have continued to hunt young women and could have taken many more lives, but Megan stopped him with her own life. And finally, what makes this story even sadder is that in November 2013, Megan's mother, who had been doing everything in her power to help the police catch her daughter's killer, passed away. She cannot cope with the devastating trauma inflicted on her by one cold-blooded criminal. Looking at Donnie's biography, it becomes clear that he could have been stopped much earlier. Among his many convictions was the charge of kidnapping a young woman, but that time he managed to escape punishment and the criminal remained free. Who knows, maybe Megan wasn't his first victim, but the police still don't know about it. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. A first-year college student was found dead in her own bedroom. Almost immediately, the police had several suspects, any one of whom could have been the killer. The subsequent events resembled a detective series with unexpected twists and a long-awaited truth obtained thanks to a tiny DNA sample. In this video, we will tell you what happened to Jennifer Holland. Jennifer Holland was born on February 23, 1988, in a small American village called Wimberley, Texas. She had loving parents, a sister named Diana, and a carefree, peaceful childhood. Soon her family moved to a city called Bryan, which was about 200 kilometers from her native village. After finishing school, the young woman entered a local college called Blinn College, where she planned to study to become a legal assistant and hoped to connect her future life with jurisprudence. She had many friends who spoke of her as a kind, hardworking and friendly young woman. She always looked at life positively and looked forward to her future career. Jenna settled near her college, renting an apartment in Autumn Woods Apartments. She also got a job as a waitress in a local restaurant to cover her housing expenses and not rely on her parents financially. Despite a busy schedule in which she had to combine studying and working, Jenna often spent time with her boyfriend, Spencer Hood. They had been dating since high school but lived separately even after Jenna moved into a rented apartment. Their relationship had been going on for several years, although the couple argued periodically. On April 8, 2008, Jenna, who was 20 years old at the time, finished her shift and, at around 9 p.m., headed home. Since Spencer studied with her at the same college and lived nearby, Jenna invited him over to help each other with their homework. At around midnight, Spencer said goodbye to Jenna and went home. About half an hour after that, they briefly talked on the phone. After which they wished each other good night and went to sleep. On the morning of April 9th, Spencer discovered that he had left his textbook at Jenna's place, which he needed for a lecture. Around 11:30 a.m., he went to her house to retrieve it. When no one answered the door, Spencer was surprised to find that it was unlocked. Thinking that Jenna was still asleep, he walked into her apartment and headed to her bedroom. However, he was met with a horrifying sight. Jenna was lying lifeless on the floor. Realizing that she was dead, Spencer immediately ran to the neighboring apartment and asked the residents to call the police. The recording of this call is publicly available. Jenna's neighbor informed the operator that she was lying on the floor not breathing, and Spencer's shocked voice could be heard in the background. The arriving police officers examined the apartment and found no signs of forced entry. The only strange thing was that the window in the second bedroom was open. Detectives immediately speculated that the killer may have entered the premises through it, but this theory was questioned due to the unlocked door. Investigators immediately doubted the theory of a possible robbery, which could have led the perpetrator to attack Jenna. As all her things were in their place, nothing valuable was missing, and her purse with money and credit cards was hanging right by the front door, which a thief would have undoubtedly taken. Furthermore, there was complete order in the apartment, no signs of struggle were observed. At first glance, there was no evidence pointing to the killer's recent presence. Examining Jenna's body, the police did not notice any serious injuries, except for a bruise on her forehead and a bitten lip. She was lying on her back, fully dressed, and the position of her body looked entirely natural. Small blood droplets were visible on her shirt collar and on the carpet near her body. After studying the body, medical experts made several important conclusions. Firstly, death occurred about 10 hours before Spencer found Jenna, meaning she was killed just an hour after she finished talking to him on the phone. Secondly, traces of strangulation were found on her body, which was the cause of death. The experts also determined that the unknown perpetrator did not sexually assault the young woman. However, Jenna tried to fight him off, as evidenced by skin and blood under her fingernails. All of these samples were immediately sent to the laboratory to try to extract a DNA sample of the perpetrator. Of course, her boyfriend, Spencer, became the first suspect for several reasons. Firstly, statistically speaking, murders often turn out to be someone close to the victim. Indicated that Jenna may have known the perpetrator and willingly let them into the apartment. During questioning, Spencer cooperated with the investigation and answered all questions. At that time, however, experts had not yet managed to extract a DNA sample from the killer. Therefore, the police could not verify Spencer's involvement in the murder. Eventually, he was released, but investigators did not rush to clear him of suspicion. Meanwhile, Jenna's friends said that he cherished her deeply and was unlikely to have caused any harm to his beloved. Next, detectives began searching for possible witnesses. The police questioned Jenna's neighbors to find out if they had noticed anything suspicious on the night of the murder. They soon found several guys who were playing volleyball near Jenna's apartment complex at that time. They reported seeing a strange guy who came out of the building near the young woman's apartment. They were surprised that this person was only wearing pants. The witnesses added that the guy looked like 26 years old, Sean Stevens, who lived in the same apartment complex. Upon learning of this, Jenna's friends told the police about another troubling fact. Some time ago, Stevens, who lived right across from Jenna, shouted insults at her from his window. It was not entirely clear what was behind this behavior, but for the police, all of these facts were enough to suspect the young man. Stevens was found and questioned. He claimed to know nothing about the murder and that he did not leave his apartment complex at night, let alone walk around without clothes. The police had no way to confirm his words, but without any serious evidence, he had to be released as well. In addition to everything else, the detective studied the possible connection of this murder to Jenna's workplace. However, her colleagues from the restaurant and the surveillance cameras showed that on the day of her death, she did not have any conflicts with anyone and such situations had never arisen before. From this point on, the investigation slowed down. The police continued to search for new leads, questioning Jenna's relatives and friends, and at some point they were able to get a new lead. During a conversation with investigators, the young woman's parents were able to recall important information that could potentially point to another suspect. 2 months before Jenna's murder, she complained to her relatives about a repairman who was doing maintenance work in her apartment complex building. One day when she came out of the shower in just a towel, she discovered a stranger in her living room. When she asked him what he was doing in her apartment, he replied that he thought no one was home. The man claimed that he did not hear the running shower and stayed to check the condition of the apartment and make sure nothing needed repair. Of course, Jenna was shocked by such a situation. She found out that the man was 29-year-old Jeremiah Rosser and reported the incident to the building manager. The police conducted a small experiment. One person stood at the entrance door and the other turned down the shower. The sound of running water was very well heard in the living room and even near the entrance door. In such a situation, it was highly unlikely that Rosser did not hear it and thought that no one was home. After talking to the building manager, the police found out that Rosser stopped coming to work a few days after Jenna's murder. This was the reason for his dismissal. All of this looked very suspicious, and the detectives tried to find the man. But here they faced one problem. Rosser moved out of his apartment and they could not determine his current location. The police only managed to find out that he has an ex-wife and 2 children. Thus, in this complicated case, there were 3 main suspects: Spencer Hood, Sean Stevens, and Jeremiah Rosser. To determine if one of them was the killer, they had to wait for the results from the lab where experts were trying to extract a DNA sample. They were working on studying the particles under the young woman's nails and drops of blood on her shirt and rug. As a result, they found out that one of the drops of blood on the rug contained genetic material that did not belong to Jenna. This sample matched the one extracted from the particles under the young woman's nails. In the end, the experts were finally able to extract a full DNA sample. The first thing they did was enter it into the FBI database. Were no matches. This meant that the killer had not previously been convicted of any serious crimes. Despite this, the police were now able to match the obtained sample with DNA samples from 3 main suspects. The problem was only that their samples were not taken during the initial interrogations. Detectives tried to contact them and were surprised to find out that all 3 had left town, and their current location was unknown. The police immediately began searching for them. Meanwhile, investigators decided not to sit idly by and use the killer's DNA sample. They began voluntarily collecting DNA samples from men who lived in the same complex as Jenna and worked in her restaurant. In total, they managed to obtain 50 DNA samples. But none of them matched the one found at the murder scene. Meanwhile, the police finally managed to find Spencer, who turned out to be 3 hours' drive from Brian at his parents' house. The young man explained that he could not cope with Jenna's death and decided to spend time with his family to distract himself from this tragedy. He voluntarily provided his DNA sample, which was immediately sent to the laboratory. The young man also allowed experts to examine his body for scratches that would undoubtedly be on the killer. After all, his pieces of skin were found under Jenna's nails. Following this, the police managed to establish Stephen's location, who also went to visit his parents, who live 720 kilometers from Blinn College. He voluntarily provided his DNA sample, which was also sent to the laboratory. While the police were waiting for the results from the laboratory, they had to find the last suspect. This turned out to be much more difficult. The police managed to contact Rosser's ex-wife, who shared some troubling facts. According to her, when their marriage was nearing divorce, Rosser was behaving aggressively towards her. He raised his hand to her, knocked her down, and tried to strangle her, which made it impossible to live with him. And the marriage ended in divorce. All of this happened around the same time that Jenna was killed. Thanks to his ex-wife, the police were able to locate Rosser. This happened in early October, 7 months after the murder. During the interrogation, he behaved quite calmly, answering all the detectives' questions. Additionally, the man had never been arrested in his life. He denied his involvement in the murder and, voluntarily, provided his DNA sample. The police also searched his car and found some interesting discoveries. A laptop was found in the car, whose serial number was listed in the theft report. A few months before Jenna's murder, her neighbor contacted the police after her laptop disappeared from her apartment. But that wasn't the worst part. The police also found keys to several apartments in the residential complex where he worked. Considering that he was fired a week after Jenna's murder, Rosser had no right to keep the keys and the manager was obliged to confiscate them. All of this indicated that the man was engaged in petty theft. But could he move on to cold-blooded murder? Meanwhile, experts from the laboratory tested all 3 DNA samples. It turned out that Jenna's boyfriend and her neighbor had nothing to do with the murder. But Rosser's DNA sample matched the sample found under the victim's nails. Upon receiving the results, the police immediately arrested Rosser, but despite the DNA match, he continued to insist on his innocence. Of course, this did not help him in any way. The man was charged with Jenna's murder. Since Rosser was not eager to disclose the details of that night, the investigators came up with their own version of what happened. Apparently, Rosser broke into Jenna's apartment with the intention of committing robbery, using a key to her door. This could have happened in the evening before 9 p.m. when the young woman had not yet returned home from work. Perhaps Rosser did not have time to commit the intended crime because Jenna came home with her boyfriend, and the criminal had to hide in the second bedroom, where he waited for Spencer to leave. It is possible that it was Rosser who opened the window, hoping to quietly leave the apartment through it, but it did not work out for him. After waiting for Spencer to leave, and hearing Jenna wishing him good night over the phone, Rosser could finally try to leave the apartment through the front door. There are 2 possible scenarios for what happened next. Either he tried to leave the apartment, but Jenna noticed him first and, in a panic, he attacked her, or he intentionally went to her room planning to commit murder. The police even suggested that he killed the young woman because she resembled his ex-wife. Considering that the man refused to admit his guilt, the case was taken to court. The wait for the trial to begin dragged on for many months, as is often the case in the state's legal system. However, just 2 weeks before the trial was set to begin, something unexpected happened. In December 2009, more than a year after his arrest, Rosser finally admitted his guilt. He entered into a plea agreement with the prosecutor in the hope of reducing his sentence. The man also asked the investigation not to involve his family in the legal process. His parents and 2 children from his ex-wife were among them. Thanks to this, the trial was completed in record time. If he had not admitted guilt, the trial could easily have dragged on for several years despite the DNA sample match. As a result, Rosser was sentenced to 55 years in prison. In addition, he received 5 years in prison for the theft of a laptop. The assistant district attorney said that, to his memory, this was the maximum sentence in the case of a guilty plea. However, Rosser had a much more serious risk, the death penalty. If the investigation had been able to prove that the murder was premeditated and planned, Rosser could have received this sentence. The man was placed in Sharon prison in Texas. He will be eligible for parole only in 2036. Given that Rosser was 27 at the time of the crime, he may be released early at the age of 55. However, if he serves his full sentence, he will only be released at the age of 82. During the trial, he refused to look his relatives and friends of Jenna in the eye. He was led into the courtroom in an orange prison jumpsuit, handcuffed. The man only nodded to his parents in greeting when he saw them in the courtroom. Otherwise, he remained silent and unresponsive with his head bowed. The victim's family had the right to speak in court, addressing the murderer directly. All 3 of them took advantage of this opportunity. Diana's sister stood in the court 60 centimeters away from the perpetrator, saying she hoped Rosser would come to realize the terrible act he had committed. She promised to pray for him and believed that she would someday be able to forgive her sister's killer. Jenna's mother expressed doubt that Rosser regretted his actions. She made the killer look her straight in the eye and said with firm conviction that he would never be able to fully understand the horror he had inflicted on their family. The father of Jenna did not plan to speak at the trial, but changed his mind at the last moment. He promised to come to any prison where Rosser is placed and tell everyone what a monster he is. He also expressed willingness to attend the hearing in 27 years when Rosser requests parole. In addition, Jenna's parents filed a lawsuit against the owner of the residential complex. They were sure that their daughter's words were not taken seriously when she complained to Rosser's supervisor about his behavior. Moreover, Rosser's keys were not confiscated after his dismissal, indicating the manager's negligence. Jenna's parents believed that their daughter would still be alive if her complaints had been taken seriously and detention had been paid. To Rosser's inappropriate behavior. The only thing that remains unclear to this day is Rosser's exact motives. Despite confessing to the murder, he refused to reveal the reasons for his actions. In any case, it doesn't matter anymore, his guilt is evident and he deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. Share your opinion on this story and don't forget to give this video a like if you enjoyed it. A young woman went missing on her way home from the bus stop. Police began a search and initially thought it would be an easy case, but to everyone's surprise, this story became one of the most complex and high-profile in British criminal history. Although the case was closed fairly quickly, its echoes have not subsided to this day, causing a lot of outrage and controversy. Helen McCort was born on July 29, 1965 in the English town of Bootle. Soon she had a younger brother and from an early age, the girl helped take care of him. Later their parents divorced, her mother married another man, and they, along with Helen and her brother, moved to a small village called Billing, located near the city. It was a quiet, peaceful place where not a single serious crime could occur for decades. The locals knew each other well and were not afraid that something bad could happen in their village. Helen grew up in this peaceful environment, had many friends and was an exemplary daughter. After graduating from school, she got a job at an insurance company located in Liverpool. The young woman stayed in Billings, so she had to get to the office by train and bus. On February 9, 1988, when Helen was 22 years old, she went to work as usual. She had agreed to have lunch with her mother that day, since her mother worked just a few streets away from her. However, the weather suddenly turned bad that day, with strong winds and rain, so they decided to postpone their lunch. Her mother came home significantly earlier, and Helen called her towards the end of her shift. She told her mother that she had planned to go on a date that evening and asked her to heat up dinner for her arrival so that she could wash her hair. Usually Helen returned home just after 5 p.m., but that day she was clearly delayed and her mother began to worry. However, soon after, the news reported that a fallen tree on one of the railroad lines, due to the bad weather, had temporarily paralyzed the train service. Her mother began to worry again and decided to call the railroad service. She explained the situation, but the operator stated that the fallen tree had blocked another road and it did not affect the train schedules that Helen would have taken. At that moment, the woman began to seriously consider that something had happened to her daughter. Firstly, Helen almost always returned home from work on time. If she planned to stay out late. Although there were no mobile phones back then, Helen could have made a call from work or any telephone booth, which were found almost on every corner. The mother thought that Helen might have been in trouble due to the bad weather. For example, she might have fallen due to the heavy rain and wind and hurt herself. The woman and her son then started calling local hospitals in all nearby towns. No one resembling Helen had been admitted. The mother also considered the possibility that her daughter might have stayed late at work and called the office, but they told her that Helen had left several hours ago. None of her friends knew where she was either. Afterwards, Helen's mother, stepfather, and boyfriend decided to go on a search. They walked along the road that Helen used to take home from work. Helen always took the same route, taking a train from Liverpool to the small town of St. Helens and then taking a bus to Billing. However, they were unable to find her, so the family decided to contact the police. They first notified officers in Liverpool and the surrounding areas, distributing descriptions of the missing young woman, but no one was able to find her. The next morning, when Helen had still not returned home or contacted anyone, the police decided to retrace her steps and reconstruct the timeline of events from the previous evening. They wanted to understand at what point along her journey from work to home she went missing. To do this, investigators appealed to the public for witnesses. They also spoke with Helen's colleagues, employees at the train station and bus company. As a result, they came to an unexpected conclusion. They were able to confirm that on the night of her disappearance, she not only took a train but also a bus to her village. This was strange, because the bus stop was only 200 meters from her home. Detectives began to suspect that she might have been abducted, because if it wasn't an accident, she would have been discovered by now. As part of the standard procedure, detectives began to investigate people close to Helen, since, in most cases, they are the ones behind such crimes. Her boyfriend and stepfather had reliable alibis for that evening, and Aunt Helen's friends and acquaintances were also excluded from the list of possible suspects. Forming search teams of 120 officers, the police began a detailed search of the area between the bus stop and Helen's house, hoping to find any clues, such as a piece or something that the potential kidnapper might have dropped. At the same time, leaflets with information about the missing young woman were distributed in nearby towns. Divers searched local water bodies and police officers knocked on every door, questioning people. They also went to all the shops, bars, and cafes in Billings. After talking to the staff at a bar called George and Dragon, they got their first lead. This establishment was located near Helen's house, and she occasionally went there with her friends. But investigators found out that just 2 days before her disappearance, the bar owner banned her from the bar after an incident. She'd had a quarrel with a drunk woman who spilled her drink on her. Helen didn't want to provoke the conflict and went to the toilet to try to clean her clothes, but the drunken woman followed her and started acting aggressively. At some point, she even tried to hit her, after which the bar owner kicked them both out. Moreover, he forbade them from ever returning. The police decided to learn more about this conflict and went to the bar the next day to talk to its owner, Ian Simpson. Moreover, this establishment was located right between the bus stop and Helen's house. The man told detectives about that evening and said that he had to kick both young women out so that their conflict didn't disturb other visitors. During their conversation, the bar slowly filled with people and it became noisy. Then the police suggested that Ian ride with them to the station to continue the dialogue in a more peaceful environment. And here, something strange happened. The man noticeably became nervous, refused to go with them, and tried to end the conversation. All of this seemed suspicious to investigators. Why was Ian so afraid to go to the station? Perhaps he had something to do with Helen's disappearance, or he knew more than he said. They decided to keep an eye on him and found out that the man was known for his philandering. Despite being a married man with 2 children, Ian constantly flirted with other women. And all the villagers knew about it. The police also found out that he constantly paid attention to Helen when she came to the bar. The investigators once again approached him and asked where he was on the evening of Helen's disappearance. The man explained that he was spending time with his lover in an apartment located above a bar. According to him, he spent most of his time there because he was afraid that his establishment could be robbed. The detective spoke with his lover, and here they encountered an interesting twist. The woman claimed that she and Ian had indeed planned to meet at his apartment at around 7 p.m. However, that evening, he called her and asked her to come a few hours later. In the end, she arrived at around 8:30, but the man wasn't home. He returned only around 11:30. All of this looked extremely suspicious. Obviously, Ian lied to the police about his alibi, which automatically made him a suitable candidate for the role of suspect. One more detail seemed strange to the detectives. The man had several fresh scratches on his neck. He said he got them during a fight with his wife when she found out about his lover. However, the investigator spoke with the woman and she denied scratching her husband. The police spoke with Ian again and he changed his story. Now the man claimed that he got the scratches while separating Helen and another drunk young woman on the evening when a scuffle happened in the bar. The detective spoke with this young woman, but she denied this story. According to her, they didn't come to blows. And none of them scratched the bar owner. Soon, the police got a witness who told them a worrying fact. On the evening of Helen's disappearance, he was passing through that street and at some point heard a piercing female scream. It was coming from the bar, but it quickly cut off. Based on all this, the detectives began to think that 31-year-old Ian Sims had a direct to Helen's disappearance. However, he continued to deny everything. The investigators needed serious evidence to tie him to this case. Otherwise, they would be powerless. Police decided to search his car where they found two gruesome pieces of evidence. Firstly, they found several blood stains and secondly, a part of a woman's earring was lying on the floor. They immediately took the earring to Helen's mother, who without a doubt confirmed that it belonged to her daughter. After that, Ian was arrested on charges of kidnapping and murder, even though the police still didn't know what had happened to Helen. They searched the bar and the apartment on the second floor where they found new evidence. In both places, there were many barely noticeable blood stains that had clearly been attempted to be washed away. On one of these spots, the criminalists found a fingerprint that belonged to Ian. Moreover, in the apartment, they found the missing part of the same earring that was previously discovered in his car. Despite such an impressive set of evidence, the man continued to deny everything. By this point, the police thought that Helen was dead. They needed to find her body. Otherwise, the court could justify Ian. They believed that the blood in his apartment and car belonged to the young woman. But in those years, DNA analysis was just beginning to be used in forensics, and organizing such research was very problematic. The man himself told the police that the blood belonged to his dog, which injured its paw. In an attempt to find more evidence, investigators decided to appeal to the public to organize more extensive searches. More than 2,000 people responded to their call, including both residents of the village and nearby settlements. Together with the police, they searched the area around Billing, including forests and fields. Soon, a new piece of evidence did appear in this case, but it was not discovered by volunteers. 25 kilometers from the village, in a place called Collins Green, a man walking his dog noticed a towel on the ground with traces of blood. He looked around and saw another such towel, as well as several pillowcases. In addition, he found men's socks, a sweater and underwear nearby. Some of these items were also covered in blood. He reported his findings to the police and they took the items to a storage facility for evidence. But here was one problem. Considering that this area was 25 kilometers from Billing, police officers from another department arrived at the call. They did not connect this find with Helen McCort's case, and the investigators who were searching for her didn't even know about the discovery of the bloody items. In the end, the police eventually saw a connection between the cases, and the inscription on the found sweater helped them. It was a print with an advertisement for a beer brand that was being sold on promotion at the George and Dragon Bar at the time. Investigators concluded that all of these things, with a high degree of probability, belonged to Ian Sims. Thus, the detectives had numerous blood samples, but they did not have Helen's body to request a DNA analysis. It was 1988 and such tools were not yet widely used. The police decided to compare the blood samples from the bar, Ian's car, and the witnesses found items with the blood of Helen's closest relatives, her parents and younger brother. The results show that these samples were very close and the blood almost certainly belonged to close relatives. Thus, the detectives were convinced that the blood samples belonged to Helen. This unequivocally indicated that Ian was clearly involved in her disappearance, but they still needed more evidence. The problem was that the expression, "no body, no case," did not appear out of nowhere. The British court rarely passed guilty verdicts in murder cases if the victim's body was not found. No matter how weighty the evidence may have seemed in the eyes of justice, there was always a slight chance that the victim might not be dead. The police hoped that they would be able to gather more information against Ian, so they questioned all of his acquaintances. After talking to the bar cleaner, they learned about another suspicious incident. The woman told them that on the morning after Helen's disappearance, she came to work as usual to clean the premises. To her surprise, she saw the owner himself doing a general cleaning. He was washing the floors, walls, and tables. Moreover, judging by the scale of the work, he had been doing it for more than an hour. The problem was that this had never happened before. Ian had never participated in cleaning his bar, and in general, he rarely got up so early. Usually, when the cleaner came for her morning shift, the man was still sleeping in his apartment upstairs. When she asked him why he had suddenly decided to clean the entire premises himself, Ian replied that his dog had made a mess. Another witness told the police that he had passed by this bar at night and heard the sound of a working vacuum cleaner from inside. The police concluded that the man had been sleeping in his apartment upstairs. That Ian had been trying to get rid of the blood stains all night, but he had not been able to completely complete the task. Despite all this, even with the suspicion surrounding Ian, they still needed more evidence. Investigators tried to find the young woman's body, but even extensive searches yielded no results. A month later, another piece of evidence fell into their hands. About 30 kilometers from Billings, and noticed a woman's purse in the grass. Looking inside, he found documents in the name of Helen McCort. The police arrived at the scene and soon they found even more evidence. Nearby they discovered the clothing the young woman was wearing on the day of her disappearance, as well as a second earring identical to the one found in Ian's car. But a more horrific discovery awaited the detectives. A coiled cable was lying near the clothes, tangled with female hair. They were sent to the laboratory and soon the experts confirmed that the hair belonged to Helen McCort. Examining the young woman's purse, investigators found a check from a pharmacy in St. Helens. It turned out that she went there shopping on the evening of her disappearance, just before taking the bus to Billings. The police found all the items purchased at the pharmacy near the purse, except for one, a toothbrush. But soon, they found it, too, not 30 kilometers from the village next to the purse, but in the same bar as Ian Simpson, where investigators were still conducting extensive searches. They also managed to find a hairpin, and Helen's mother confirmed that the young woman went to work with her that morning. But that was not all. In the bar they found a clump of female hair that belonged to Helen, confirmed by DNA analysis. Despite all of this, the detectives continued to cling to every detail and handed over the woman's clothing to the laboratory. After a thorough examination, forensic experts found traces of carpet on it, identical to the one in the inn. In addition, they found traces of dog hair on the clothing, which matched the hair of Ian's dog. After that, the experts began to study 2 rings and a bracelet that were seized from the man after his arrest. Forensic experts found traces of dirt on them and compared them with the soil in the area where bloody towels and Ian's clothing were found. As surprising as it may sound, they were able to prove that the dirt was from that region, which once again confirmed that the man was there and had himself thrown away these things. Soon after this, the police found another piece of evidence. Near the town of Rixton, located 24 kilometers from Billings, they found a shovel. They were able to determine that the shovel belonged to Ian Simpson and apparently he used it to bury Helen's body. However, they still couldn't find the body itself, despite the constant work of hundreds of volunteers. The young woman's relatives were almost 100% sure that she was dead. With such a colossal set of evidence, waiting for a miracle was simply pointless. Yet they couldn't finally confirm this and give her a decent burial, as well as be sure that the perpetrator would be punished. Ian continued to insist that he had nothing to do with the murder, and eventually, the police handed the case over to the court. The trial began a year after Helen's disappearance in February 1989. This was one of the first cases in Britain where a person was tried for murder in the absence of the victim's body. Therefore, despite the huge amount of evidence, the prosecution doubted their victory. According to their version, that evening Helen got off the bus and headed home along her usual route. When she passed by the George and Dragon bar, Ian Simpson noticed her and started talking to her on some pretext. Perhaps the man was trying to discuss with her the incident that led to him banning her from his establishment. Then he must have lured her inside somehow. According to the investigation, Ian could have offered to resolve the conflict and lift the ban on her visiting the bar. Where Helen could go with her friends, she was interested in resolving the conflict. Apparently the man lured her inside the building, where there was no one else at the time. Almost immediately after that, he attacked her, which was confirmed by the testimony of a passing witness. He heard a female scream that was quickly cut off. Attacking Helen, Ian killed her with an electric cable and dragged her into his second floor. From there, he possibly subjected the young woman to violence, after which he waited for darkness and loaded the body into his car. The man drove her away from Billing and buried her, after which he scattered her things, his clothes, and other items in other remote places. There were several versions regarding his motives. The first one was forced. From the testimony of many witnesses, the investigation knew that Ian had repeatedly shown signs of attention to the young woman. But she always refused him. Probably that evening he saw an opportunity to fulfill his criminal desires. The second version was that during their conversation, some conflict arose between them and he killed her in a fit of rage. It is possible that he and Helen began to argue and she threatened to tell his wife about his constant harassment. However, this theory looked less realistic. After the prosecution spoke in court, it was Ian's turn. He still claimed that he was completely innocent and told his version, and it was one of the strangest speeches ever made by a man accused of murder. The man claimed that someone framed him, someone else sneaked into the bar, put on his clothes, lured Helen there and killed her. After that he put her body in Ian's car and buried it with Ian's shovel in an unknown place. The killer drove the car back to the bar and disappeared, framing the innocent bar owner. After such statements, the jurors became even more convinced that Ian was directly involved in the murder. His story sounded completely absurd. Perhaps he already understood that he would most likely go to prison and decided to make fun of the justice system and the victims' relatives. As a result, on March 14, 1989, the man was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to apply for parole no earlier than 16 years in prison. Unfortunately for Helen's family, it was far from the end. The police and volunteers continued to search for her body, but without success. 3 years after the sentencing, the young woman's mother wrote a letter to the killer, desperately pleading to reveal the location of her daughter's body. After some time, Ian replied, but his letter contained only insults and threats. He promised to take revenge on the woman as soon as he was released from prison. The killer repeatedly appealed, but all his appeals were rejected. Only in 2004, when he had already spent 15 years behind bars, one of the appeals was granted and the case was sent for review. It did not play in the killer's favor. With the help of modern DNA analysis tools, experts examined the evidence and concluded that all of them unequivocally proved Ian's guilt. As a result, the case review essentially led to an increase in the prison sentence. After 16 years, the criminal repeatedly applied for release, but all his applications were rejected. Helen's family continued to fight to find her body. In 2015, her mother launched a public campaign seeking to change existing laws. She demanded that convicted murderers be denied early release until they disclosed the location of their victim's body. The woman gave interviews to various channels, wrote letters to Prime Minister Theresa May, and also created a petition that gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. As a result, this issue was brought to Parliament for consideration, and initially, politicians positively assessed the possibility of passing such a law. However, time passed and Helen's mother initiative was constantly delayed. All these delays led to the fact that in November 2019, after 30 years of imprisonment, Ian Sims finally achieved early release. This event was a heavy blow to the young woman's family, as they had practically lost any hope of finding the location of her remains. 3 months after the decision was made, the killer was released. 63-year-old Ian Sims returned to a normal life. However, he did not enjoy his freedom for long. In late June 2022, the man died from an illness, taking the secret of Helen's body's location with him to the grave. Helen's mother is still alive and does not plan to give up. She now hopes that Ian may have told someone among his cellmates where he hid the body. She also continues to fight for the adoption of a law that would prohibit the early release of murderers who refuse to disclose the location of their victim. Thus, the Helen McCort case lasted for several decades, although it was solved in a matter of days. Despite the overwhelming evidence against the criminal, he continued to keep secret information that would have allowed the relatives of his victim to say goodbye to her and start to heal their wounds. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. A 16-year-old young woman went home on her bicycle and disappeared. The next day her body was found in a field near the road. The unknown perpetrator had killed her and fled. Despite the fact that the police had a DNA sample of the perpetrator, they could not find him until 13 years later. In this video, we will tell you what happened to Maryann Vastra and why this murder is in Dutch history. Maryann Vastra was born on August 10, 1982, in the Netherlands. She lived with her parents in De Westreen, a small village in the north of the country, far from large cities. The young woman was the youngest of 6 children. She had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. Over time, almost all of the older children left for other cities and countries, and Maryann was left to live with her parents and 1 older brother. The young woman studied at the local school, was fond of music, and had many friends. The area where she lived was dotted with small towns and settlements located a few kilometers apart. For this reason, Maryann often went to other localities to spend time with friends or go shopping. In her free time, she also worked at the local supermarket as a part-time employee. On April 30, 1999, the country celebrated a big holiday, Queen's Day. Maryann finished her shift at the store and went to a nearby town called Colum to spend the evening with her friends at a local cafe. A few hours later, their company was joined by Maryann's boyfriend and his friends, and together they all decided to go to a settlement called Boykenpost, which was 6 kilometers away. The group rode there on their bicycles, but Maryann did not have one, so she borrowed a bicycle and went for a ride with her friends. After a while, they decided to go home, and the young woman headed in the direction of her town, which was about 11 kilometers away, but she never made it home. Her parents thought that Maryann had stayed the night with a friend who lived in Colum, although this was doubtful. The young woman had promised to be home by evening, and if she had decided to spend the night at her friend's, she would certainly have called home. Early in the morning, Maryann's father called at the house of her best friend, Affie. To his surprise, he heard that his daughter had said goodbye to her friend that night and headed home. At this point, it became clear to everyone that something bad might have happened to Maryann. Her friend called her boyfriend, took her sister with her, and together they drove along the route Maryann took home. Meanwhile, the young woman's father decided to go to the police immediately. He told them that his daughter had not returned home and none of her friends knew where she was. Soon 2 officers arrived to take a missing persons report, after which they returned to the station and prepared to begin their search. Meanwhile, Affie and her sister and boyfriend were driving near the settlement of Finklister with vast fields on either side of the road. At one point they noticed something shiny in the grass and stopped. As they approached the field, they saw a bicycle lying in the grass. A little further away, about 15 meters away, was the awful sight of Maryann laying there. She had no clothes on and there was a cut on her neck. All 3 were shocked. Affie wanted to check Maryann's pulse, but could not bring herself to approach the body. It was obvious that the young woman was dead. But her best friend couldn't believe it because of the intense shock. She struggled to get her phone out and called the police. Several officers arrived on the scene at once and 2 police officers went to Maryann's family home. At the time, they did not yet have official confirmation of the victim's identity, so the officers picked up her father and drove him to the scene. Forensic investigators were already on the scene at the time and the father, to his grief, immediately identified Maryann. After examining the scene, the detectives noticed an important detail. There were 2 bicycle tracks leading from the road to the place where the young woman's body was lying and only 1 track in the opposite direction. That meant the killer was also on a bicycle. The police searched the surrounding area for clues and even conducted aerial photography, but the only thing they could find near the murder scene was a lighter. And did not have a lighter, so the police sent her to the lab. Medical examiners determined that the young woman had been abused and found traces of semen from which they were able to compile a sample of the killer's DNA. The same DNA was found on the lighter. It was uploaded to the police database, but there is no matches. This meant that the perpetrator had no previous criminal record. The police chose a Maryann boyfriend named Spencer as a suspect. There was no evidence against him, but it seemed to the head of the local police department that the boy was the most likely killer in such a case. However, the young man voluntarily provided his DNA sample, and it did not match the one found on the victim's body. In the meantime, the crime had been covered extensively in the local media and on television. Such murders were almost unheard of, and the public demanded that the police catch the culprit as soon as possible. The problem was that detectives were already deadlocked within the first week. They had a DNA sample of the killer, but no suspects. The police also received numerous calls from local residents. Some of them thought someone they knew might be behind the murder, but there was no confirmation of any of those theories. Pointed to one specific place. Near the field where Maryann's body was found was a migration center for people who had applied for asylum. Most of the people there were from Iran and Syria. With each passing day, this theory spread through the local towns. And at one point, an impressive number of people were 100% certain that a refugee had committed the murder. Because of this, the police had to investigate this possibility. On May 5th, Maryann's funeral was held. Almost 1,500 people came to support her family at that moment, many from neighboring communities. 2 days later, the woman's parents organized a memorial procession, at the end of which they addressed the public. A total of about 20,000 people took part in the event, mostly due to the active national coverage of the case. More and more people contacted the police each day. And at one point the detectives got a really interesting lead. Several people reported seeing Maryann at a cafe one night as a certain Oriental-looking guy approached her and tried to get to know her. After the young woman refused, the guy made a gesture toward her with his thumb along her throat. Given that the young woman was killed in this manner, the police immediately began searching for the young man. He turned out to be a 15-year-old refugee from the same migration center. He admitted that he had indeed made such a gesture, but denied any involvement in the murder. The boy gave a DNA sample and it did not match the one found on the victim's body. Despite this, local residents continued to blame the refugees from the migration center. The organization even had to hire additional security guards in case of possible conflicts. 12 days after the murder, people came out to the migration center to protest. At first they simply shouted out demands to give them the murderer, but by evening the situation had escalated greatly. Several people threw Molotov cocktails in the direction of the building, forcing the police to intervene. Since then, security at the center has been significantly stepped up, and there have been no more demonstrations of this kind. A few days later, the police announced the arrest of a 32-year-old man named Pitt, who lived in the same town as Maryann. He was a local alcoholic and was disliked by most of the residents. The arrest came after a witness contacted the police that he had seen Pitt in bloody clothes the night of the murder. The man was detained and his DNA sample was sent to the lab. Almost instantly, journalists spread the word nationwide about the new suspect. The DNA didn't match the sample, and the witness admitted to making up the whole story in retaliation against Pitt for a personal grudge. Investigating a possible connection to the immigration center, police began examining the logbook, which records all movements of refugees from the asylum area. They had the right to leave the center, but to do so they had to check the log and indicate where they were going and why. It turned out that 2 refugees had left the center on the night of the murder, but had not indicated where they were going. They were 26-year-old Ali and 19-year-old Mohammed. Police began looking into their possible involvement, but no details were released for a long time. Maryann's father was unhappy that investigators were keeping his family in the dark and still hadn't found the killer. He contacted a well-known crime reporter who agreed to take over the case and tried to find more information. On July 1st, the father of the victim appeared on a popular television program where he voiced the facts discovered by the journalist. First, the 2 refugees who left the center on the night of the murder were in the same cafe as Maryann. They also left almost immediately after the young woman left with her friends. Second, since that very night, the whereabouts of these men have been unknown. They had not returned to the center and the police could not find them. At the same time, they had photographs of both men, but for some reason, the authorities did not publish them. After all these facts were made public on television, the police stated that they were currently searching for these suspects together with Interpol. The main theory is that they may have fled the country. All this has again aggravated relations between local residents and refugees. In early October, they again gathered outside the center to protest. On October 9th, Turkish police reported the arrest of one of the suspects, 26-year-old Ali. It turned out that all this time he had been living in Istanbul. He was taken to the Netherlands, where a DNA sample was taken and the necessary tests conducted. It did not match the sample found on the victim's body, and the man was cleared of suspicion. The investigation has since stalled again, and at some point, the police and Maryann's family began to suspect her boyfriend again. Even though his DNA did not match the sample, Spencer's behavior seemed suspicious. The young woman's acquaintances and relatives were certain that Maryann would never ride her bike home at night because she was afraid of the dark and the distance was not that short. Spencer should have sent her home by cab, which even Maryann's parents knew. Instead, he let her go alone on her bicycle. The young man was questioned several more times, and here began something strange. He changed his testimony about that evening several times. Originally, Spencer said that he had met Maryann at a cafe, after which they drove to the Bhutan post. On re-examination, however, he stated that the young woman had gone there with friends before he even got to the cafe. So Spencer went to her on his bicycle. He went on to say that on the way there, he saw two guys walking with a bicycle. At one interrogation, Spencer said he did not recognize them because it was very dark outside. Then, he said they were two of his friends. This all seemed strange, but the police had no evidence against Spencer, and his DNA did not match the killer's sample. The case stalled for several more months. On December 20th, the police decided to enlist the help of the public and asked all the men in the area to volunteer their DNA samples. But there was trouble waiting for them. It turned out that the law forbade the mass collection of DNA from citizens even with their consent. So the authorities set a limit for the police. They could only take 150 samples, among which there was not a single match. From that point on, the case practically came to a standstill for several years. Maryann's parents tried to push for a change in the law that would have allowed extensive DNA screening, but they were turned down. The rationale was to protect people's privacy, even though such measures had already led to the capture of the perpetrator several times in other countries. In July 2001, the detectives announced an approximate profile of the perpetrator. They believed the killer was a local man between the ages of 20 and 40. The police again requested permission to conduct a large-scale collection of DNA samples within a 5-kilometer radius of the Maryann murder scene. But they were again denied. After that, the case finally came to a standstill. The victim's parents continued to participate in television shows and gave interviews, but each year, the case attracted less and less attention. There was no new evidence to help solve the gruesome mystery. In 2010, the police assembled a team that created a detailed 3D model of the crime scene and all available evidence using the latest computer technology. This again drew widespread public attention, and Maryann's parents again talked about the need for DNA screening. This time, 11 years after their daughter's murder, authorities decided to finally consider changing the law. The process took almost 2 years, and on September 6, 2012, the necessary amendments were passed. Police called a press conference to ask all men who were between 20 and 40 years old in 1999 to submit their DNA samples. The collection area was also limited to 5 kilometers. They estimated they were talking about 8,000 men, but not all of them agreed to give their DNA. The police managed to collect just over 6,500 samples, and experts began to study them. Unfortunately, the resources of the lab were limited. They had time to check about 400 samples a week, so the study had to take up to 4 months. The experts compared the samples to the killer's DNA profile, but they weren't just looking for a complete match. After all, it was unlikely the perpetrator would have given his DNA to the police. The lab was also trying to figure out the similarities by which they could establish kinship and trace back to the killer through a father, brother, or other relative. On November 19, a month after the test began, experts finally got a long-awaited match. Was that they didn't just find a familial link, they got the DNA of the killer himself, meaning he voluntarily provided it to the police. Detectives soon announced the arrest of 45-year-old Jasper Seringa, a local farmer and father of 2. His house was only a few kilometers from where Maryann was killed. At first, the man kept silent, but after a conversation with his lawyer, he decided to confess. But the public only learned the details of this terrible crime on March 28, 2013, when the trial began. According to Jasper, that late evening he was finishing up chores on his farm and decided to ride his bicycle before going to bed. As he himself admitted most of the time, riding his bicycle was just a cover for him. In fact, he was riding to a neighboring village to take advantage of the intimate services of local women. His wife was unaware of this, but in court he said that he had not intended to go there that night and had simply planned a ride to take his mind off family problems and difficulties on the farm. At one point he noticed Maryann alone on an empty and dark road. Then it occurred to him that he could do whatever he wanted with her. Jasper drove up to her, took a penknife from his pocket and threatened to silence her. He then took her to a field, where he abused and killed her. At the trial, the man insisted that he did not mean to kill the young woman and did it out of panic. He realized what he had done and what the consequences would be for his entire family. His children were 5 and 8 years old at the time, and they were about to find out what their father had done. For this reason, Jasper decided to kill Maryann and go into hiding, but his conscience has been bothering him ever since. He continued to live in the area, listening to talk about the murder and seeing the family of his victim, whose lives would never be the same again because of his heinous act. Since then, he has repeated thoughts of turning himself into the police, but he's never made up his mind. When a massive DNA screening was announced in 2012, Jasper realized he would be figured out. He had so many relatives in the neighborhood, and one of them would certainly have turned in his DNA. Experts would find a partial match and start looking into all his relatives, which would inevitably lead to his capture. So Jasper decided to give his DNA, but he still couldn't bring himself to come to the police station and confess. The trial lasted only a few weeks, and on April 19, the judge pronounced his sentence 18 years in prison out of a possible 20 years under Dutch law. After 13 years, Maryann's relatives finally saw the perpetrator punished, but the judicial system gave them an unpleasant surprise. Due to his good behavior, Jasper is scheduled to be released as early as 2023, meaning he has spent less than 10 years behind bars. Share your opinion on this case in the comments below. A young woman disappeared from her apartment, which she rented with her sister. The police couldn't find a single clue, and the case went cold for decades. It wasn't until 53 years later that they were able to uncover the gruesome truth, and it happened in a very unusual way. In the small American town of Helena, Montana. She grew up in a close-knit family and had many friends. Her acquaintances noted that the girl from an early age was responsible and could always come to their aid. Pamela also loved animals, and her parents bought her a black Labrador. She did well in the local school, and in high school, she was passionate about learning the Russian language. After high school, the young woman took a job as a surgical nurse at St. Peter's Hospital in her hometown. Although her parents' home was relatively close to work, Pamela sought to establish an independent life. For this reason, she moved out of her parents' house and moved into a rented apartment with her cousin Mary, who worked at the same hospital. The young woman rented a 2-bedroom apartment on the second floor of an apartment complex. Early in the morning on February 17, 1968, Mary went to work at the hospital. Pamela was still asleep since she had to go out for the evening shift that day. The Labrador also slept in her room. A few hours after Mary left for work, Pamela's father drove by their apartment complex. Near the building, he noticed his daughter's Labrador running around without a leash. The week before, the dog had broken loose and run away from its owner, and Pamela had to pick it up from the local shelter. So what he saw didn't surprise the man. He knocked on the door of their apartment, but there was no answer. Thinking his daughter had gone to work, he took the dog and left. At 3 p.m. Pamela was supposed to go to work, but she never showed up at the hospital. Her cousin tried to call the home phone at their apartment, but there was no answer. When she got home, Pamela wasn't there, and Mary and her parents began to get seriously worried. Pamela was a very responsible person and would never miss her shift without a good reason, especially without notifying management. Besides, if the young woman was going somewhere, she would certainly tell her parents and sister. Another cause for concern was the fact that Pamela's car was parked in the parking lot of the apartment complex. This fact also made it less likely that the young woman had gone somewhere on foot all day. The relatives waited until the next morning and contacted the police. They took a missing persons report but were in no hurry to start a search. Pamela was 19 years old and investigators did not rule out that she left home of her own free will. After inspecting her apartment, detectives found no signs of forced entry or a struggle. Everything looked routine. They asked her sister to look through Pamela's things and tell her if everything was there. Mary noticed that her coat, terry cloth robe, purse and winter boots were missing from their apartment. 2 days after Pamela's disappearance, police organized a search operation within a 30-kilometer radius of her home. They searched fields, forests and bodies of water while volunteers and the young woman's relatives handed out flyers on the city streets. Patrolmen interviewed Pamela's neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances. None of them had seen the young woman the day she disappeared and had no idea where she might have gone. Her supervisor at the hospital said Pamela was supposed to pick up a check for $200 that day, but never showed up. This further indicated that the young woman was unlikely to have run off somewhere, leaving behind the money she had earned. In the first days of the search, police interviewed more than 100 people who had anything to do with Pamela. Some of them were interrogated by polygraph, but it yielded no results. Investigators were also unable to find any evidence that the young woman might have left town. With no leads on their hands, the police concentrated all their efforts on the search operation. They expanded the area to about 50 kilometers around the city and brought in additional forces. Because many parts of the area were not easily accessible to pedestrians and cars, the search involved many officers on horseback. Speaking to reporters, the sheriff said that this was the most effective, as a person on horseback could see better and an animal could smell a dead body and demonstrate this behavior. The search continued for a month, but was inconclusive, and eventually the sheriff decided to suspend the search operation. Since then, the case has essentially come to a standstill as the detectives have had no leads on their hands. In April, 2 months after Pamela disappeared, something unusual happened. A patrolman in Great Falls, a town about 140 kilometers from Helena, stopped a car for speeding. He issued a warning to the woman behind the wheel and let her go. Later, as he was writing the report at the station, his colleagues noticed one odd thing. The driver's license the woman showed the officer was issued in the name of Pamela Dorington. The Helena detectives asked for a description of the woman's appearance, and from what he said, it looked very much like she was the one behind the wheel. This news gave new hope to the relatives of the missing young woman, except that investigators never managed to find the car and its driver. On June 13th of that year, nearly 4 months after Pamela's disappearance, the sheriff's office received a call. A national park ranger just a few miles from Helena was walking near the docks at the lake and noticed a human body in the water. From the water, it was turned over to experts who proceeded to examine it and determined that it belonged to a woman about 17 to 23 years old. Detectives almost immediately made the assumption that the deceased was Pamela Dorington. Along with it, they found several items of clothing that were similar to items from Pamela's closet. They showed them to her sister and parents, and they confirmed that Pamela did have something similar. The medical examiners found several stab wounds on it and signs that the young woman had been abused, but the torso alone could not be identified. All of this was before DNA testing was available. The only thing the experts could surmise was the approximate time the body had been in the water. In their opinion, it could have been there for about 4 months, which coincided with the time of Pamela's disappearance. In the weeks that followed, investigators, along with divers, searched the lake and the adjacent Missouri River, trying to find missing body parts. But it was inconclusive. Despite failing to identify the deceased, the sheriff told reporters that the body was very likely Pamela's, so police were no longer investigating a missing person, but a murder. However, this discovery did not bring them any closer to the perpetrator himself, as there were still no leads. Since then, there has been no progress in the case. Police told reporters and Pamela's family that they had several suspects, but it was impossible to determine their involvement without any evidence. A year after the murder, the sheriff contacted a psychologist in Detroit who specialized in particularly violent crimes. From the information available, he concluded that the perpetrator was a psychopath. with twisted desires, which was the motive for the murder. Given this, it is unlikely that he could have stopped at one murder, and detectives should expect more similar episodes. At the same time, the expert suggested that this man was capable of easily hiding his true face and leading an ordinary lifestyle. All this information did not help the sheriff much, but no other threads of the investigation he no longer saw. The man gave the psychologist the names of his suspects and asked him to assess which of them could commit such a crime. But the expert could not draw such conclusions without additional evidence. Pamela was not buried until 7 years after the murder on June 14, 1975. In all that time, investigators never found her other remains, nor did they come any closer to catching the perpetrator. They continued to consider all sorts of possibilities. Once the detectives even turned to clairvoyance, but the result was quite expected. 15 years after the 1983 murder, something interesting happened. The landlord of the apartment Pamela and Mary had rented was found guilty of murdering his wife. In 1968, a man named Brooke Atlas lived on the first floor, directly below their apartment. He had been on the list of possible suspects since the early days, but a complete lack of evidence prevented any conclusions about his involvement. He later married and moved into a private home with his wife. In 1983, their home burned down and experts were quick to determine that it was arson. Moreover, the body of Ellis's wife was found in the house, but the cause of her death was not fire. The pathologist determined that she had been killed by strangulation. Investigators assumed that the man decided to get rid of his wife and house because of financial problems. Shortly before, he had declared bankruptcy, and the loss of his insured home could have resulted in a hefty payout from the insurance company, but instead he received a life sentence for murder without parole and an additional 20 years for arson. We're interested in this episode. Atlas, who lived literally a foot away from the victim, had the opportunity to kill her. The man could have used a spare key, and over the months of living near the young woman, he may have well learned their work schedules. Detectives talked to Atlas, but he denied all allegations. Given that there was not a single piece of evidence against him, the cops had no choice but to accept it and hoped that sooner or later new leads would emerge in the case. In the 38 years that followed, no progress was made. Pamela's parents passed away without learning the truth. And of her closest relatives, she had only a younger brother. He had given up hope of finding out what had happened to his sister. But in 2021, the case was given another chance. It was turned over to the Unsolved Homicide Squad. The new detectives decided to reopen the investigation. Pamela's murder was not typical of such units. They usually reopened old cases where the perpetrator left his DNA behind, but because of the lack of analytical tools in those years, it was impossible to use that to catch the killer. In Pamela's case, there was no evidence at all, and the detectives could only hope for luck. They studied all the materials left by their predecessors, including a list of possible suspects. Brooke Atlas stood out clearly since he had already been in prison for the murder of his wife. The man was 79 years old at the time and was still serving his sentence. Investigators realized that proving his guilt after 53 years would be very difficult. And the man was unlikely to live to see sentencing. Not only could the trial drag on for years without a single piece of evidence, but no judge would even consider such a case. So the detectives decided to take a very unusual approach to the matter. They went to Atlas in prison and offered him a confession to Pamela's murder. In exchange, they guaranteed him that he would receive no additional punishment for it. Such moves on the part of law enforcement are quite rare, especially when it comes to a brutal murder. But in this particular case, they knew they had only two options. Wait until they got their hands on some new evidence, which was highly unlikely, or get a confession. And given Atlas's age, the second option could disappear at any moment. Besides, Pamela's only living close relative was her brother, who was also of advanced age. The detectives wanted him to know the truth, told him about the possibility of such a deal, and the man agreed. The investigators brought their offer to Atlas and waited. To their surprise, it worked. The perpetrator said he was ready to confess, but the detectives were in no hurry to rejoice. They needed to make sure that the man was really involved in the murder, rather than taking the blame for someone else's crime. They spent many hours questioning him about the details of the murder, Atlas confessing that he had planned Pamela's murder in advance. After waiting for her sister to go to work, he went up to their apartment and rang the bell. When Pamela opened the door, he told her there was a leak in one of the pipes in her apartment and urgent repairs needed to be made. Pamela let the man in without a shadow of a doubt. Once in the apartment, he attacked her and strangled her, then took her body back to his apartment and abused her. This was the main motive for what he did. Atlas then placed her in a barrel and took her to the warehouse of the small airport where he worked as a flight instructor. That very day, a few hours after the murder, the man was quietly conducting a few lessons with his students. The barrel stood in the warehouse for several days, after which Atlas took it to the banks of the Missouri River, separated the body and dumped it in the water. In addition, the man told police several facts that were never divulged, so only the killer could know them. With all this information in hand, the detectives had no doubt that Atlas was telling the truth. 53 years later, they finally succeeded in solving the case, though they had to guarantee the murderer full immunity. Remarkably, the murderer decided to accept the deal for a reason. He said that during his imprisonment, he believed in God and began to feel remorse and apologized to Pamela's relatives for what he had done. The Detroit psychologist's analysis turned out to be quite accurate. Atlas really seemed a decent man. For a long time, he had worked as a heavy equipment operator, then he began teaching flight lessons, started a family. Only after the murder of his wife, his true nature became clear. The victim's brother thanked the investigators for bringing the case to an end. The man understood that a conviction and an additional life sentence for Atlas wouldn't have changed anything. And thanks to the detectives, the case was over. Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to like this video if you liked it. Thanks for watching. A woman mysteriously disappeared from her own home and her friends decided to go to the police. At first it looked as if she herself had gone somewhere, but with each new clue, the case became more and more creepy. Eventually, investigators were able to uncover the mystery and the truth turned out to be quite frightening. Mindy Schloss was born in 1955 in New York City. When she was 25, she moved to Alaska, where she graduated from a local medical university. The woman earned a degree in psychiatry and took a job as a nurse at Fairbanks Hospital, though most of the time she had to work on the field. Many people in remote areas of Alaska were not able to go to the hospital on their own, so Mindy and her colleagues would use all manner of transportation, including boats and airplanes, to get to them. She loved her job and took it as seriously as she could. Mindy lived about 600 kilometers from the hospital in Anchorage. She took a plane to work and stayed in a hotel all weekdays, going home on weekends. It was August 2007. Mindy, who was 52 years old at the time, returned to Anchorage for the weekend and was soon to fly back to work. During her absence, she always asked her best friend, Jerry, to stop by her house to feed her cat and give him the medicine he needed. On Saturday, August 4th, her friend called her to discuss the matter, but Mindy never came to the phone. She still hadn't been able to reach her all day, and it was strange. So Jerry contacted their mutual friend, but he too had not called Mindy that day. At first, Jerry thought Mindy had gone somewhere on business, but she didn't answer her phone the next day either. Then her friend decided to drive to her house. No one answered the door knock either, and Jerry used her spare key. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The house was in order, there were no signs of a struggle or any other evidence that something bad had happened to Mindy. It was only on the way out that Jerry noticed something strange. The doorknob of the front door was loose, and the woman decided to tighten the screws with a screwdriver. After that, she went to work without knowing where her friend had disappeared to. On Monday, August 6th, Jerry called the hospital where Mindy worked. To her surprise, the woman never showed up for work, which was completely out of character for her. Nor did she contact any of her coworkers to alert them of her absence. All this indicated that something might have happened to the woman, and Jerry decided to contact the police. The police department took a missing persons report, and Jerry and the detective went to Mindy's house again. No sign of a break-in was found. There was also nothing of value missing from the house. This ruled out the possibility that a burglar had broken into the woman's home. What's more, Mindy had some medications in her home that were only available with a doctor's prescription. Any burglar would most likely have taken them since they were in demand among people with drug addictions. Upon entering the garage, they discovered that Mindy's car was missing. It was also very strange. The woman always took a cab to the airport and only used her car to get around town. The police concluded that something really bad had happened to the woman. A forensic team examined the house, trying to find any clues, but it was inconclusive. At the time, the kidnapping theory was unlikely. The police thought Mindy might have probably had an accident. She often went to the countryside and the terrain in those parts was quite dangerous. People could have fallen prey to wild animals or just accidentally fallen off a cliff. But this theory did not bring the police any closer to solving the case, and they decided to begin a search for suspects who, in theory, could have been involved in her disappearance. The first thing they did was check on Bob, Mindy, and Jerry's mutual friend. The men were eager to cooperate with the investigation, and the detectives quickly determined that on the day of the woman's disappearance, he was at work many miles away from her home. The police had no clear answer. The woman had not been in touch since Saturday. After examining her computer, experts determined that the last time she used it was at 1:30 a.m. that same day. With no solid leads, police decided to enlist the help of the public. They posted flyers around town with information about the missing woman and distributed the information to local TV stations. The same day, they began receiving calls from witnesses, but most of the leads led nowhere. People reported seeing Mindy in various places and even in other states. None of these leads were ever helpful. Meanwhile, Bob and his co-workers decided to comb the area where Mindy might have gone. She had been out in the countryside quite often for berries or just out for a walk. Unfortunately, the search also yielded no results. The detectives decided to go a different route and contacted the bank the woman used. They asked them to check to see if there had been any activity on her cards in recent days, and this is where a serious lead finally awaited them. Early Sunday morning, the day after Mindy went missing, someone had withdrawn $500 from her debit card, the maximum amount available for withdrawing in a 24-hour period. Police immediately obtained the ATM camera footage from the bank, and they got a disturbing sighting. It turned out that the money had been withdrawn by an unknown man. His face was covered by a bandana, so they could not identify him. He pulled down the bandana only after his face was out of the camera's field of view. As a result, the police had no choice but to wait until the man tried to use someone else's card again. Meanwhile, the detectives received another tip. They learned from Mindy's co-workers that the woman was planning to renovate her home and had hired workers. At some point, she had a conflict with their supervisor over the cost of the work. Mindy later admitted to her co-workers that she was afraid of him because he acted strangely during visits to her home. The police checked on the man, but he turned out to have an alibi for the day the woman. They also questioned another worker who came to her house on Friday around 7 p.m. The man was also uninvolved and he couldn't remember anything suspicious that night. It wasn't long before detectives had a new lead. Bank security reported that Mindy's card had been charged $500 again in the early morning hours, but this time from a different ATM. After studying the security footage, the police immediately realized it was the same man as the first time. But there was something odd on the tape. The man withdrew the money and left, but returned to the ATM a few seconds later. He walked around it for a while, pushing buttons, and eventually left again. After calling the bank, detectives found out the reason for his strange behavior. The unknown person forgot to take the card out, and the ATM then takes it away to prevent the theft. The real owner can get it back by going to the bank with his ID. Of course, this was not an option for the criminal, so he lost access to Minnie's account forever. This time, the police managed to find a witness. He drove up to the very same ATM when an unidentified man came out of there. According to the witness, he got on his bicycle and rode away. It was a significant lead since most people were traveling by car or on foot, but all that information was still not enough to get any closer to a clue, and detectives decided to interview everyone in the Mindy area. They asked people to recall any oddity or to point them to neighbors who were suspicious. To their surprise, many residents named one particular house right near Mindy's house. According to them, parties were constantly held there. The residents were always making noise and disturbing the peace. The detectives went there and found out that quite a number of people were living there, but they weren't willing to talk to the police. The detectives then went to a woman who lived directly across the street from the house. She said she did not see anything suspicious, but her demeanor showed that she was very nervous. The next day, the woman called the police station and asked the detectives to meet, but not at her house. They met at another location and the woman shared a creepy story. Shortly before the detectives' first visit, a man who lived across the street had stopped by to see her. He said police were walking around the neighborhood and asked the woman not to tell them he lived here. When asked why, he said he was on parole and did not want the police to know his location. At night, the woman heard someone walking on the porch of her house. She looked out the window and saw that it was the same man. He stomped around, looked in several windows and left. The woman was greatly frightened and decided to tell the police about it. Detectives learned his name was Josh Wayne, who was 27 years old at the time. After running him through the database, they found out that the guy had been convicted of murder 7 years earlier. At the time, he was accused of beating a woman to death, but a jury acquitted him. As a result, Josh was accused of tampering with evidence and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. After spending 3 years behind bars, he was released early. Detectives immediately identified him as a prime suspect. After talking to his housemates, they found out that Josh didn't have a car and that he got around mainly by bicycle. But there was just one problem. When police began looking for him, the man had disappeared without a trace. On Thursday, August 9th, police suddenly had another lead. A local trucker called them and said he had spotted Mindy's car in a parking lot near the airport. He had seen its picture in the newspaper and immediately recognized the car. Detectives arrived on the scene and confirmed that the car was indeed Mindy's. They also noticed that a surveillance camera was pointed at the parking lot from a nearby building and requested a recording. It showed a man driving this car into the parking lot at 12:30 p.m. on August 4th. Getting out and wiping down the door handle, apparently, he was wiping off his fingerprints. Unfortunately, the quality of the recording did not allow his face to be seen. CSI examined the car for prints or traces of DNA and were able to recover some samples. However, it took time to study them and there was no guarantee it would be useful in the case. On the passenger seat was Mindy's purse, which could indicate that the woman had been in the car with the perpetrator, alive or dead. Not getting the results they wanted from using modern analysis tools, the detectives decided to use search dogs. Few believed this idea would succeed since it had been a week since Mindy had disappeared. But for lack of other options, they still turned to film dogs. The service dog was taken to the ATMs from which the unknown man had withdrawn money, as well as Mindy's car. The dog picked up the trail and headed down the street toward the woman's house, located 3 blocks from that location. After sniffing the front door, she went straight to the very house where Josh Wayne had previously lived. The detectives, who until recently had not believed in the search dog idea, were shocked. The service dog directly pointed them to the fact that Josh was in Mindy's car, near her house and near those ATMs. The next day, the police repeated the experiment with another search dog. The result was the same. The dogs walked the entire distance and stopped at Josh's house. Though it was not an unqualified piece of evidence that would work in court, the detectives decided not to waste their time and obtained a warrant for the suspect's arrest. They went to his house, but the man hadn't been there in days. After searching the building, they found the same jacket that the unidentified man had been wearing on the cameras near the ATMs, and in the pocket was a cash withdrawal slip from Mindy's card. Next, they discovered a woman's gold watch and immediately showed it to Jerry. The woman confirmed that the watch belonged to Mindy. The experts were able to compare the DNA samples found on the steering wheel of Mindy's car samples from items from his home, and they matched. This indicated that Josh had been in the missing woman's car. This evidence was already much more serious, and the police were focused on catching the suspect. Leaflets with his name were posted all over the city, and they even rented several billboards. According to detectives, it was one of the largest manhunt operations in Alaskan history. Virtually every law enforcement officer was working on the matter, and locals reported any suspicious evidence. At one point, police released ATM camera photos and were approached almost immediately by a woman named Lisa. She said she had met Josh before and was sure he was the one in the photo. The important thing here is that the police did not name the main suspect, but what followed was the turning point in the case. Another acquaintance of Josh's came to the police with a confession. For the past week, she had been helping him get around town by transporting him in her car. One day he left his backpack in the back seat and the young woman and her mother looked inside. There they found several more ATM receipts as well as a phone. In the gallery they found a photo in which Josh was supposedly holding a gun in his hand. For the police, this information only added to the alarm. Detectives already feared that the suspect might attack someone else while they were looking for him. And thanks to his phone, they found out that he was also armed. The cops tried to convince his girlfriend to help them catch Josh. They wanted the young woman to take a tape recorder with her and go to meet him, where they would try to get him to talk about what he had done to Mindy. But the young woman was too scared and refused. Soon, however, she had to participate against her own will. On September 2nd, Josh came to her house and in an aggressive manner began demanding her backpack. Given that the young woman gave it to the police, she had to come up with an excuse on the fly. Realizing she didn't have the backpack, Josh asked her to take him somewhere far away from here to hide from the police, but the young woman refused. She offered to let him stay at her house, but Josh suspected something was wrong and left. The young woman realized that she would not be safe until the police caught the man. So she decided to follow him discreetly in her car, calling the detectives along the way. At some point, Josh reached his acquaintance's house and went inside. By that time, the police, SWAT, and FBI had already begun to converge on the scene. Everyone feared that the suspect would not surrender without a fight, and those fears proved to be true. Using weapons, Josh took two people who were in the house with him hostage. A lawyer was invited to negotiate with him, who after several hours managed to convince him to surrender. During the interrogation, he hardly spoke to the police, but the investigators were in no hurry to accuse him of killing Mindy. At that point, they already thought the woman was probably dead, but without her body, it would have been extremely difficult to prove it. So Josh was only charged with stealing Mindy's bank card and watch. The FBI agent decided to get crafty. He listed the charges to Josh and he said they were all lies. The investigator then stated that they had evidence that he was the one who withdrew the money from someone else's card. And Mindy herself had gone to the police to report the card theft. Upon hearing this, the suspect grinned and asked what games they were trying to play with him. From this reaction, the FBI agent was finally convinced that Josh had killed Mindy, but the police still had to find her body in order to charge Josh with murder. They had to work against the weather. It was snowing early in that area, and they would have no chance of finding Mindy if her remains got snowed in. On September 13th, police received a call from an electrician working near the town of Wasilla, about 100 miles from Anchorage. He spotted the body of a woman in a wooded area and immediately thought it was Mindy, and experts from the lab confirmed it. The deceased was indeed Mindy Schloss. The medical examination revealed that the woman had been shot in the back of the head and her remains had been disposed of by fire. After the bullet was recovered, it was determined that it had been fired from the very weapon with which Josh had been apprehended. All the police had to do now was to figure out how the events that led to Minnie's death unfolded. Meanwhile, the experts continued to examine every millimeter of her house, trying to find any trace of Josh's presence. It was extremely difficult to do so. They had to collect virtually every hair from the floor of Mindy's house and then examine it in the lab. It took months, but eventually they were able to find a hair that belonged to Josh. This was confirmed by DNA testing, and the detectives now had proof in hand of the suspect's presence in the victim's home. On May 18, 2008, 10 months after the murder, he was finally charged and brought to trial. While gathering witnesses to testify against Josh, an interesting situation occurred. His ex-girlfriend, Lisa, who had identified him from a photo near an ATM, refused to testify in court. She regularly visited her ex-boyfriend in prison, and at one point, the couple announced their intention to marry. Investigators were shocked by this turn of events, but they quickly realized what was behind the move. The U.S. Constitution allows relatives not to testify against each other, and in all likelihood, Josh convinced Lisa to marry him for these reasons. There was one problem, though. Soon after the marriage was consummated, it was declared null and void because state law prohibited weddings with inmates. But the detectives wondered why Josh was so intent on shielding Lisa from questioning and testifying. Was it really all about some pictures outside an ATM where you couldn't even see his face? Most likely the young woman knew a lot more. Investigators tried to get her to talk, but at first they did not succeed. However, at some point, Lisa herself contacted them and said that Josh confessed to her about the murder during one of her visits to the prison. According to his story, there was a party at his house Friday night. Josh, who had no means of livelihood, decided to sneak into the house next door and steal something. That house turned out to be Mindy's place. Josh opened the door of the house and began to search the house for valuables. At one point, Mindy walked into the room, and he immediately realized that if he let her live now, he wouldn't be able to avoid jail. He didn't want to go there again, so he grabbed the woman, took her to the bathroom, and tied her hands. The perpetrator then went to his house to get a gun, taking some handy things to kidnap her with. Before returning to Mindy's house, he put bags of her legs and secured them with duct tape so as not to leave any trace. He then took the woman to the garage, put her in his own car, and drove out of town. After an hour of driving, he stopped in a wooded area and drove Mindy away from the road, where he killed her. Josh then returned to her house, cleaned, vacuumed the carpet, and left. The trial did not begin until the spring of 2009. The prosecution had offered Josh a deal. He would confess to killing Mindy and another woman 7 years earlier in exchange for waiving the death penalty. This way, the authorities hoped to close 2 high-profile cases at once, and Josh agreed. As a result, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison without parole. During the reading of the sentence, Josh cried, but at one point things heated up. When the judge called him a coward for taking the lives of 2 women, the criminal jumped up and shouted, "What about the men I killed?" At this point, his lawyers grabbed him and silenced him before he could say anything else. That shouting kept the detectives busy. For 5 long years until, in 2014, Josh himself offered authorities a new deal. He agreed to confess to the murders of 3 men if he was transferred from a local prison to a federal prison. Apparently, the conditions there were much higher. Considering that the criminal's request was insignificant, the authorities agreed. Josh said he killed one man in Anchorage in 1994 when he was only 14 years old. He committed the next murder in 1999, and he killed the 3rd man a year later, the same day he massacred the woman. The first 2 men have been identified, but the identity of the 3rd is still a mystery. Investigators have no doubt that Josh was indeed involved in the murders. They are more concerned about another question, whether there are no other crimes under his belt, about which he is silent. In any case, the police have managed to permanently isolate him from society and prevent other murders that would surely have followed. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it and subscribe. The 15-year-old young woman went out for a walk, promising her parents she would be back soon, but she never came home and her phone was turned off. The parents contacted the police, who began a search for the missing young woman. Detectives had no leads until they gained access to her Facebook account. It was there that the eerie clue as to what had happened to her lurked. Nicole Cable was born on August 12, 1997, in the small American town of Glenburn, Maine. Her parents divorced when she was young, and the young woman was left to live with her mother, stepfather, and 3 younger sisters. During her high school years, Nicole had a passion for music, was on the cheerleading team, and even modeled for a local company. She also had many friends who described the young woman as cheerful, helpful, and kind. She always tried to keep a positive outlook on life, even though she, like many teenagers, had her own difficulties. In the spring of 2013, when the young woman was 15 years old, she was looking forward to the approaching school vacations and her birthday. Only a few months separated her from getting the driver's license she had dreamed of for so long. Nicole lived in a tiny town where there was practically nothing but a few apartment buildings. Were larger communities where almost all of her friends lived, and there were many more distractions. Even her school was a 20-minute drive from home, and she had to wait for the bus every morning. On Sunday evening, May 12th, Nicole told her parents that she was going to meet a friend and would be back soon. She left the house at about 9 p.m. and headed along the main road, but she never returned home. Concerned parents tried to call her, but her phone was turned off and she hadn't logged on to social media. When they contacted her friends, they learned that none of them had seen Nicole that night. After waiting until morning, her mother decided to go to the police. She had hoped to the last that Nicole had simply stayed the night at her friend's house, even though that raised serious questions. First of all, the young woman had never left home all night without her parents' permission. She would certainly have contacted her mother and told her where she was. The police immediately began a search. At first stages, they refused to stick to any one version. Investigators admitted that the young woman could have left home of her own free will, but they also did not rule out a criminal element. The first day of searching brought no results. Police interviewed friends and relatives of the young woman and began searching for her in the Glenben area, to report their daughter missing and urge the public to help find her. That same day, her friends printed and posted hundreds of flyers both inside and outside Glenben. Police asked for volunteers to stay away from the area to avoid having service dogs pick up her trail. On the second day, the police held a press conference where Nicole's mother made an appeal. With tears in her eyes, she asked her daughter to return home if she ran away of her own free will. The mother also spoke out about a possible kidnapping and urged those responsible to let Nicole go if someone was holding her. The head of the local police added that the search operation would be expanded. The FBI and state police became involved, bringing the total number of officers involved to 45. The public soon learned one disturbing fact. Nicole's mother revealed that her daughter had been texting with a certain guy on Facebook for weeks. Police accessed Nicole's account and discovered that this young man was Brian Butterfield. Moreover, based on the correspondence on the day of her disappearance, the young woman had arranged to meet him at the edge of the street where her house was located. At first, the police declined to comment on the situation, but new details soon emerged. It turned out that Brian had gone to the same school as Nicole and knew her personally. The guy claimed he had only spoken to the young woman a few times in his life and had never corresponded with her on Facebook. Against this backdrop, another oddity was noticed. There were two Brian Butterfield Facebook accounts. Only one of them was deleted the night Nicole disappeared. Brian himself stated that he only had one account and had nothing to do with the second account. Furthermore, he was aware of the existence of this fake page, and had even complained to the police a few weeks before Nicole disappeared. It all looked really strange, and the police were in no hurry to accuse the young man of any crime. Instead, they continued to search the area around Glenben, hoping to find some evidence. At the same time, the computer department was taking a detailed look at this suspicious Facebook account. On Friday, May 17th, the sheriff turned to the public for information. Police were looking for a black Ford Ranger pickup truck and asked for any information about the vehicle. They clarified that the driver's involvement in the young woman's disappearance has not been determined and it is too early to draw any conclusions. The sheriff also announced a 24-hour hotline for any tips on the case. They had to allocate a separate number as the number of calls had crossed several hundred. They were enlisting volunteers to search the area. They set up assembly points and put people into groups. The volunteers were to look for anything that might be relevant. And this time, the search area was greatly expanded. It extended to the two nearest towns, Bangor and Old Town. More than 500 people responded to the police call. The crowd included about 400 local residents and about 100 professional volunteers from the various counties. Were off-road vehicle and horse-drawn search parties. Given the sheer scale of the operation and the rough terrain, the authorities tried to use every resource possible. They even used aerial photography in the hope that the footage might reveal something of value to the investigation. The day after the search, exactly 1 week after Nicole's disappearance, the police issued a disappointing statement. The young woman's body was found near Old Town, not far from Road 43. They were in no hurry to release any details, specifying only that the body was covered with branches and was discovered by a service dog. Soon it was announced that the police had a homicide case, and the next day, May 20th, they reported the arrest of a suspect. It turned out to be a 20-year-old local man named Kyle Doobie. No details were known at the time, and the public was kept in the dark for some time. The next day he was formally charged with premeditated murder. At the same time, it turned out that at the time of his arrest, he was already in prison. The guy had been sentenced to 90 days in jail for eluding police and a motorcycle accident last year. Kyle began serving a sentence 3 days before Nicole's body was discovered, but had been on the outside until then. According to the young woman's friends, she had known Kyle for several months. The day before she disappeared, she complained to several friends that Kyle had tried to kiss her, and Nicole had to give him a serious fight to get him to stop. Nevertheless, the police so far had kept the evidence against the man a secret. It was known that he lived with his parents and a 4-year-old daughter, over whom he had custody. Kyle was also dating an 18-year-old young woman named Sarah and worked for a local disability care company. His attorney asked for a closed-door preliminary hearing, and the judge granted the request. Consequently, the public and the media had no access to information about the case, and the judge's decision was criticized. Nicole's funeral was held on May 26th. Beforehand, several hundred local residents gathered and honored her memory by launching balloons into the sky. A few days after the funeral, a judge, under public pressure, lifted a public disclosure ban on the case, and some disturbing facts finally came to light. First, police were able to determine that the fake Facebook account was registered from Kyle's computer and all subsequent sessions were conducted from his IP address. This meant that it was Kyle who had tricked her out of the house shortly before the murder, and it was clear from the medical examiner's report that the young woman had died on the very day of her disappearance. Second, the police had several important witnesses at once, Kyle's own brother and his girlfriend. According to Sarah, whom the suspect was dating, Kyle confessed to her about the murder a few days after it happened. This happened immediately after Sarah was called in for questioning. There it became clear to her that the suspect was not the suspect. That the police had suspicions about Kyle, but there was no evidence. He was also questioned but stated that he was at work the day the young woman disappeared. Kyle told his brother that he lured Nicole to the outskirts of town using a fake Facebook account. The guy planned to make it look like Brian Butterfield had kidnapped her and was holding her in a remote location. Next, Kyle planned to find her and set her free, which he thought would make the young woman fall in love with her savior. It all sounds strange to say the least, but there is more to come. Remember only that this is the perpetrator's own version, told to his brother. Further events unfolded as follows. From a fake account, Kyle lured Nicole to a remote location along Hudson Road. There he was already waiting for her, lurking in the bushes. He was wearing a ski hat covering his face. When Nicole arrived at the appointed spot, he pounced on her, wrapped tape around her head, and loaded her into his father's pickup truck, a black Ford Ranger. The car was parked nearby. Next, in his own words, Kyle drove her away from the abduction site. As he began to pull her out of the car, he noticed that the young woman showed no signs of life. The guy realized that the duct tape made it impossible for her to breathe, and she passed away. Then, he panicked and decided to hide the body. To his girlfriend, Kyle told the same story, adding some details. He said that before he hid the body, he took off almost all of Nicole's clothes and threw her out the car window on the way back home. This was done so that the police would not find traces of his DNA. The police did find several items of clothing that belonged to the young woman. They were in virtually the same place where Kyle had attacked Nicole. The key point here was that Kyle told his girlfriend almost exactly where he had hidden the body. It was because Sarah went to the police telling the whole story that they were able to locate Nicole's body. Kyle himself refused to admit guilt, but the situation was far from in his favor. When the police uncovered all the details of the medical examination, more serious evidence emerged against the suspect. Under Nicole's fingernails, blood was found that matched Kyle's DNA sample exactly. When the boy was questioned a few days after the murder, there were deep scratches on his face. He himself attributed it to an injury he sustained at work. Also, the cause of the young woman's death was strangulation, as evidenced by the injuries to the neck. And this went against Kyle's versions of what he told his brother and the young woman. If he had taped the victim's mouth and nose, there would have been no such injuries. His lawyer requested a psychological evaluation, which caused the trial to slow down. But a few months after his arrest, something interesting happened. Kyle was charged with theft after a stolen gun was found in his home. The guy had been arrested multiple times before for robbery, but each time he got away with a fine. An examination showed Kyle to be completely sane, and a trial was set for February 2015. While awaiting trial, the defendant was in jail. Before the trial began, Kyle's attorney filed a motion to exclude certain witness statements from the case file. One of them was the correctional officer where Kyle arrived to serve a sentence for eluding police and a motorcycle accident. According to the officer, the guy was acting very nervous and even crying. When asked why he was so nervous, Kyle said something like, "It's not about the time limit, it's about what else I've done." The trial began on February 22, 2015. Kyle's lawyer stated that his client was innocent of murder and that the investigation was completely biased. According to the defense, he was at home at the time of the murder and Nicole was attacked by someone else. Kyle's girlfriend, Sarah, was named as a possible suspect. She allegedly hated Nicole because of her association with her boyfriend. The lawyer claimed that she had access to Kyle's computer, from which she could create a fake account to frame her boyfriend after the murder. This theory had no corroboration and went against the actual evidence. Kyle logged into the fake account not only from his computer, but also from his phone. What's more, he logged in through one app, changing his personal account to a fake one. Because of this, it was clearly visible when he logged out to one account and immediately logged into another. Also, there was no physical evidence against Sarah, unlike Kyle. His DNA was found not only under the victim's fingernails, but also on her clothes, which the killer threw away on his way home. The next witness was the real Brian because Brian had previously dated his girlfriend. In his opinion, this is what led Kyle to create a fake account with his name so that he could frame the young man if anything happened. The prosecution also provided screenshots of correspondence showing that Kyle was not only communicating with Nicole, but also with other underage young women. The next witness was a colleague of Kyle's who worked with him at a disability care company. The defendant's lawyer insisted that the scratches on Kyle's face appeared while he was working, but the witness denied this. According to his story, on May 11th and 12th, he and Kyle were at the home of a woman suffering from mental illness. At one time, she became aggressive and attacked Kyle, leaving several scratches on his face near his eye. Kyle went to the hospital for help, only to notice the next day, May 13th, a coworker noticed new scars on his face. This happened right after Nicole disappeared. Another co-worker said that the day Nicole disappeared, Kyle left work at about 9 p.m. and did not return until 6 a.m., even though he was supposed to be on duty all night. At the same time, he asked that he not tell anyone about his absence. The court also summoned 4 inmates with whom Kyle had interacted while in jail, awaiting trial. They all said that Kyle had confessed to them about killing the young woman. To one of them, he told them he had strangled his girlfriend and made it look like an accident. To the other, he openly stated that he had originally planned to commit the crime. Even more interesting was the testimony of an inmate named Scott Ford. He had spent most of his life behind bars and had a reputation for being well-versed in the legal system. Kyle had been in contact with him for a long time, after which he decided to inquire about the best way for him to get away with his crime. Next, Kyle wrote several versions on paper of what had happened to Nicole and handed the pieces of paper with this information to Ford. All of these versions had one thing in common. Kyle admitted that he had created a fake account and lured Nicole to a deserted area, but he went on to describe different versions of events. First, he wrote that he had just wanted to kidnap her and then rescue her, but he didn't settle for duct tape and the young woman suffocated. On another sheet he said that he had jumped Nicole out of the bushes and she fainted from fright. Panic, Kyle duct taped her mouth shut and drove her away from town, after which he noticed she had no pulse. Another version was that he didn't use the duct tape and the young woman died for nothing. Another version said that Kyle jumped out of the bushes and grabbed her torso, then realized that he had actually squeezed her throat, after which she lost consciousness. As we can see, all of these stories seem downright delusional, but there was something really useful in them for the investigation. Kyle described in detail the place where he attacked her, and where and how he hid the body. Moreover, he specified the exact location where he had hidden the ski mask in which he had attacked the young woman. All this information was kept secret until the beginning of the trial. So only the killer could know such details. Experts examined the sheets and found fingerprints and Kyle's DNA on them. The trial was not without his difficulties. Kyle's younger brother, who had testified against him 2 years earlier, began to deny the fact that Kyle had confessed to the murder. The problem was that the brother had written down all the details of what had happened in great detail, which he could only have learned from Kyle. The only one who didn't utter a word during the entire trial was Kyle himself. He refused to testify even in his own defense. The investigation offered him a deal in which he could expect a reduced sentence in exchange for a confession, but he refused. On March 6, 2016, the final court hearing was held at which the verdict was handed down. Kyle was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Nicole. His relatives and attorney tried to get a lenient sentence, citing his age and having a young daughter, but the court refused to make concessions. Kyle received 60 years for murder and another 30 for kidnapping. In closing arguments, the judge noted that the evidence against Kyle was overwhelming and his guilt in the case was clear. Instead of showing remorse and confessing, he made up various versions of what happened and tried his best to avoid prison. For this reason, the court refused to commute his sentence. Moreover, the judge was inclined to believe that Kyle had originally planned to kill Nicole, a plan he had been working on for weeks. Nicole's parents called the sentence fair and expressed the hope that he would never get out of prison again. They also gave numerous interviews and appeared on various television shows talking about the dangers of social media, using their daughter's murder as an example. In their opinion, the tragedy could have been avoided if the perpetrator had not had the opportunity to impersonate another person online. However, people like Kyle, sooner or later, can get to the point of murder even without fake accounts. Share your opinion on this story. This creepy story happened in the middle of 2021. A young woman went on a first date with a guy to the movies, but that evening turned into a tragedy. Despite the fact that this case was fairly quickly solved, there are so many strange and shocking moments in it. In this video, we will tell you what happened to Riley Goodrich and Anthony Baraha. Riley Goodrich was born and raised in the American city of Corona, California. In school, she played volleyball and was a cheerleader, as well as had many friends. They described her as a positive, open and fun-loving young woman with a big heart. After graduating from high school, Riley received a scholarship to Grand Canyon University in Arizona. She moved to a dormitory but tried to visit her family whenever possible. In the summer of 2021, she finished her first year and returned to Corona for the holidays. On July 4th, on Independence Day, her friends threw a big party. There, Riley met a young man named Anthony Baraha, who was a year older than her. They quickly developed a liking for each other and continued to communicate in the following days. Anthony, unexpectedly, became a popular figure on TikTok. In 2019, he created an account where he posted various humorous videos. At some point, his videos began to attract the attention of a wide audience, and by the summer of 2021, he had almost 1 million subscribers. The guy also actively developed his account on Instagram, but was still trying to figure out what to do in the future, continue to run his blog as his main activity, or do something else. After chatting for some time on social media, they decided to go on a first date, but it was important for Riley that her father Dave approved of her choice. Despite the fact that she was already 18 years old at that time, the young woman was very close to her parents and wanted them to meet Anthony first. At first, the young woman's father was skeptical, mostly because Anthony made a living through TikTok. It all seemed not very serious to him. However, when they met in person, Anthony made a good impression on Dave, and the father approved of his daughter's choice. The guy seemed to him kind, well-mannered, and overall a positive person. In the end, Riley and Anthony decided to meet on July 26th and go to an evening movie session, choosing the movie The Forever Purge. The plot of the film is based on the fact that in the United States, every year they including murder. Who would have thought how creepy of a coincidence it would be to choose this movie? Before heading to the cinema, they had dinner at their favorite restaurant, Riley located nearby. Their screening started at 9:30 p.m. and ended closer to midnight. Considering it was a weekday, there were not many people in the theater. During the movie, Riley messaged her mother that the film seemed boring to her, but she still enjoyed the day with Anthony. The young woman did not contact her mother anymore after that. When the movie ended, a theater employee went into the hall to clean up the room. To his surprise, he found Riley and Anthony there. From a distance, it seemed to him that the couple was just sitting or sleeping in their seats, but as soon as he took a few steps towards them, he was horrified to discover that both visitors were seriously wounded and unconscious. The police and ambulance arrived at the scene. The medics almost immediately determined that Riley had already passed away. Anthony was still alive but in a serious, unconscious condition. He was taken to the local hospital and connected to life support equipment while detectives began investigating the crime scene. At first, it was difficult for them to understand what had happened in the theater. The only thing they managed to establish almost immediately was that the police had already was the fact that Riley and Anthony were shot in the head. However, there were no clues at the crime scene that could shed light on what had happened. Of course, it was absolutely useless for detectives to take fingerprints or search for DNA samples in the cinema, so they went a different way. Almost immediately, the story spread through California media and later throughout the country. In the first hours of the investigation, there was even a theory that Anthony could have been the killer, allegedly shooting Riley and then taking his own life, but the police did not even consider this version, if only because in that case the weapon would have been lying nearby and it was nowhere to be found. As soon as the detectives identified the victims' identities, they contacted their families and informed them of what had happened. Riley's parents simply could not believe that their daughter was dead. Just a few minutes before her death, she was texting with her mother, and no one could have thought that something so tragic could happen during a movie screening. In addition, the police could not provide any details to her relatives about what had happened, as they themselves still had no idea what had happened in that theater. As for Anthony, the doctor's prognosis was bleak. The young man had suffered a serious injury, and the medical staff had to do everything possible to help him. First, the detectives questioned the theater employees who worked that evening. It turned out that only 6 tickets were sold for the showing. This meant that the killer was most likely one of the 4 visitors. There was another aspect that puzzled not only the police, but also everyone who learned about this incident from the news. If the killer was one of the 6 viewers, how did the other 2 visitors not hear the sounds of gunfire? The only explanation at that time was that the killer was one of the 6 visitors. Was the version that the other 2 viewers simply took the sounds of gunfire as part of the movie. This action movie had many violent scenes, including the use of weapons. The theory that the killer struck during one of these scenes was not excluded. However, this mystery was quickly solved. Detectives found that out of all the tickets sold, 4 were purchased by one person for himself and 3 of his friends. Could have been committed by a group of people. The investigation continued all night, and the next day the police announced the arrest of the suspect. He turned out to be 20-year-old Joseph Jimenez. The interesting fact here is that pure chance helped to catch the suspect. It turned out that Joseph himself called the police the next day after the murder, but he did not do this to confess to the crime. At around 9:30 p.m., Joseph called 911 and reported that someone was chasing him. When the police arrived, they found him in the middle of the street with a gun in his hand and arrested him. They immediately realized that the attack in the theater was carried out using a weapon of the same caliber, so they handed Joseph's gun over to the experts. Having 3 empty shells from the theater in their hands, they established that this was the same weapon. But the detectives quickly found another weighty evidence. Searching the suspect's house, they found Riley Goodrich's wallet there. Later, the police located the other 3 individuals who were at the movie theater with Joseph. It turned out that they were all friends with him, but their story truly shocked the detectives. According to them, none of them had any idea that a simple trip to the movies would turn into such a tragedy. They were just sitting and watching the film, but during the screening they began to notice something strange. Joseph suddenly began to behave very suspiciously. He was talking to himself and muttering something. At some point he said that he needed to go to the bathroom and left. However, instead of going to the bathroom, he went to his car, took out a gun and returned. After sitting for some time, he suddenly told his friends that he had brought a gun from his car, and they began to panic. In the end, the friends allegedly lied to him, saying that they also needed to use the bathroom and would return. But instead they left and went outside. There were many strange moments in their story that could be doubted. The most concerning part was their escape from the theater. Did they really not try to find out why Joseph brought a gun, and did they not consider that he might use it against the two other moviegoers? Moreover, the friends did not report any of this to theater staff or the police. Joseph's behavior, practically indisputable, indicated that he was planning to do something bad. But his friends decided to simply ignore the entire situation, and they admitted that as soon as they heard about the murder, they immediately thought of Joseph. All of this was enough to arrest Jimenez on 3 charges: murder, attempted murder, and robbery. At that time, Anthony was still on life support, but in the end, the doctors could not help him. On the evening of July 31st, he passed away without regaining consciousness. In connection with this, Joseph was charged with an additional count of murder, which carried the possibility of a death sentence. While detectives tried to get any information from him, hundreds of concerned people held a farewell ceremony in memory of Riley and Anthony outside the movie theater. They lit candles and expressed words of support to the families of the victims. It was then that it became known that long before the incident, Anthony had signed papers allowing his organs to be donated to those in need in the event of his death. The young man could hardly have imagined that it would happen so soon. The situation was not looking good for Joseph Jimenez. With the evidence against him, he was almost guaranteed to end up on death row. Apparently, he understood this perfectly and decided to confess to the crime. However, his story raised even more questions. Joseph claimed that he was diagnosed with schizophrenia 9 months ago, which he had been managing with medication. Shortly before the incident, he stopped taking his medication and voices started to appear in his head. At first they told him that someone was going to steal his car and TV, but later they threatened to kill his entire family. On the night at the cinema, he heard the voices again, and this time, they ordered him to kill Riley and Anthony. They also promised to kill his entire family if he refused. According to Jimenez, he tried to resist these voices, but in the end he gave in and committed the crime. In his speech, he devoted a lot of attention to how scared he was during the murder and in the following hours, as well as how he worried about his future. Of course, this turn in the case was perceived ambiguously. Let's look at the facts and try to understand if we can trust him. Could Joseph have made up this whole story about the voices? Of course. Moreover, only serious mental problems could have saved him from the death penalty in this case, so it was his only chance to avoid such a sentence. In addition, the petty theft of Riley's wallet does not fit into his story, according to which Joseph was so frightened that he immediately ran out of the cinema and got into his car after the shots. Who, in a panic, is going to steal a wallet? On the other hand, there are still many strange moments in his actions. If we believe his friends, he talked to himself and behaved suspiciously. In addition, Joseph himself called the police, saying that someone was chasing him, but in reality, he was just standing in the middle of the street with a gun. If we assume that all of this was a planned game, the plan to avoid responsibility seems too complicated. But if we still consider such an option, the situation could have developed in a completely different way. During the movie, Joseph realized that there were only 2 random people in the theater who he could rob. He went to his car to get a weapon, but something went wrong, or perhaps he truly intended to commit murder. It's possible his friends were even present at the time and didn't leave the theater. However, it's unclear why he didn't take the victims' smartphones if that was his motive, and why did he call the police the next day instead of hoping not to be caught. Additionally, Joseph had no criminal history and had never been in trouble even for minor offenses. It's hard to imagine someone without a criminal past suddenly committing double murder over a wallet, especially with such a high likelihood of being caught. In late September, the first court hearing took place, during which Joseph pleaded not guilty, citing his mental state. This doesn't mean he denies involvement in the murders, but now the court needed to consider the issue of his sanity. Jimenez stated that he would only plead guilty if deemed insane. The next court hearing was scheduled for the first half of 2022. A decision about the defendant's mental state has not yet been made, as he still needs to undergo evaluation. In any case, whatever the outcome of this case, it is shocking in its injustice. The two innocent young men simply wanted to spend an evening at the movies and ended up as victims of a completely random act of aggression. The public and media blamed the theater management for not checking Joseph upon entering the theater. But should they be blamed? In the United States, theater staff only check backpacks and bags. Prevent visitors from bringing in outside food. But if someone brings a gun and hides it under their clothes, no one will ever know. The only thing that can be done in such a situation is to install metal detectors in every theater. Perhaps this will become a mandatory requirement over time. What do you think? Was Joseph truly mentally ill and that led to his horrific act? Or was the story about the voices fabricated to avoid a death sentence? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching. An 18-year-old student came home for the holidays, but after a few days, she disappeared without a trace. Her mother began receiving strange messages, and soon the police got involved. What they discovered during the investigation truly shocked the entire family, and none of them were prepared for such a truth. Soon she had two younger sisters, but in 2005 her parents divorced and the young women stayed with their mother. In 2010 her mother remarried and they had another daughter. Thus Angelica had three younger sisters with whom she got along well. Angelica graduated from a local high school and enrolled at Longwood University in Farmville, located about 3 hours from home. She joined two sports teams and planned to finish her studies a year early, which required her to work at an accelerated pace. Despite this, she regularly visited her family in Norfolk to see her parents and sisters. In March 2015, when Angelica was 18, she went home for spring break, planning to stay there for a few days. Angelica had a great time with her family, was in a great mood, and was happy to have the opportunity. Live at home again. On the morning of March 2nd, her mother prepared her three younger daughters for school and then went to work, leaving Angelica alone at home. However, when her mother returned from work in the afternoon, Angelica was no longer there. Everything looked like she had left in a hurry. The back door was open, music was playing, and only some of her things were loaded into the washing machine. Her mother found this strange because she and her daughter constantly kept in touch, and Angelica was supposed to inform her if she was going somewhere. But that day Angelica didn't answer her phone. Then her mother wrote to her and asked where she had gone. Angelica replied that she had gone for a walk with friends but didn't specify where exactly and when she planned to return home. They exchanged several messages and her mother noticed something strange again. According to her, the messages from her daughter were very different in style from what she was used to. Usually, Angelica wrote her detailed messages, telling her all the details. But this time, she only received short and vague phrases. Despite this, her mother did not suspect anything bad, especially since her daughter was already 18 years old. And she thought that the young woman just wanted to spend time with her friends. On that day, Angelica never came home, but continued to respond to messages. However, she still did not give clear answers about where she was and when she planned to return home. In the second half of the day, the young woman stopped responding to her mother. Then she decided to call Angelica's friends and found out that none of them had seen her daughter and did not know where she was. By the evening of March 3rd, the mother decided to turn to the police. Detectives began an investigation, and at first glance it seemed like the young woman had left on her own free will. Soon this version was supported by a note found in the house. Angelica's mother claimed that it was probably written in her daughter's handwriting. There was only one sentence with a very strange content. Angelica wrote that due to everything that was happening, she needed time alone with herself. No one in her family could understand what she meant. The young woman was cheerful, spent all of her free time studying and making plans for the future. She never mentioned any serious problems in her life, so the note seemed meaningless. The police also found that Angelica left her clothes, wallet, and car at home. This already contradicted the version that she had gone somewhere of her own free will. However, at that time, there was no evidence to the contrary. The first lead appeared several days after the investigation. A neighbor named Cody, who lived near Angelica's family, found a piece of her credit card near his house. He reported this to the police and immediately became the main suspect. Detectives assumed that he could have some connection to her disappearance, so they questioned him for 12 hours. He denied his guilt, and yet the police did not rush to remove suspicion from him. Angelica's relatives also believed that he was hiding something. By that time, all residents of the area knew about this case, and many tried to help the investigation. People formed teams and searched the area for any evidence. They all began to suspect Cody after the credit card incident. Moreover, it turned out that he and Angelica attended the same school and dated for some time. Soon, another event occurred that indicated his involvement in her disappearance. Less than a week after the investigation began, Angelica's stepfather, Wesley Hadsell, burst into Cody's house and found Angelica's jacket there. The situation developed quite strangely. Wesley, who was involved in the search for his daughter with her friends, told them to go to Cody's house and look for Angelica's things, as he believed that the boy was involved in her disappearance. The friends did just that. They went to Cody's house and found her jacket there, which they immediately reported to the police. Cody was interrogated again, putting serious pressure on him. Despite this, Cody said that he had no idea where the jacket came from. All of this greatly confused investigators. On the one hand, the jacket in Cody's house was a very serious piece of evidence. But on the other hand, during the interrogation, the detectives had a strong impression that the boy was telling them the truth. He was willing to voluntarily provide his DNA sample, undergo a polygraph test, and do whatever they asked. But most importantly, he provided an alibi for the day of Angelica's disappearance. The police checked this information and concluded that he could really be innocent. Then they talked to Angelica's friends who found the jacket, and they told them that Wesley, Angelica's stepfather, gave them the tip. With this information, the detectives allowed that the man here was the main question. Why would he do that? The most obvious option was that Wesley was involved in his daughter's disappearance. The police began to study his biography and found that the man had more than 10 convictions for crimes of varying degrees of severity, and even more charges were not proven in court. He was repeatedly arrested for robbery, possession, and use of illegal substances. He kidnapped his own wife and subjected her to violence for several days. However, the court could not prove his guilt, so he did not receive any serious punishment. He had been in prison several times in his life, spending several years there in total. The detectives also found out that a few weeks before Angelica's disappearance, her mother kicked Wesley out of the house because he started using heavy illegal substances. Since then, he had been living in a hotel. All of this was enough to seriously consider him a suspect. During the interrogation, the man claimed that he had nothing to do with the disappearance of his daughter and was actively trying to find her. When asked when he last saw Angelica, Wesley stated that he saw her at a gas station around noon on the day of her disappearance. The young woman had asked him for a few $100s before they parted ways. However, the detectives reviewed the footage from the gas station cameras and found no evidence to support his claim. Wesley's colleagues at work reported that he had taken a few hours off on that day as his daughter had asked him for money. He returned to work at around 2 p.m. and was extremely nervous. There was an obvious contradiction in his statement. Wesley had told his colleagues that he needed to leave because his daughter had asked for money, but he told the police that he had accidentally spotted Angelica at the gas station while driving by. Furthermore, Angelica's car was parked near her home, so it was unclear why she would be at the gas station. When asked why he left work that day, Wesley stated that the alarm at the house where he lived before the quarrel with his wife had gone off, and he received a notification on his phone. The police could not verify this information and did not explain the obvious contradictions in his statement. The police then obtained a warrant to search Wesley's motel room, where he had been staying for the past few weeks. They found something interesting. Wesley had been keeping firearms and a large number of bullets. Since Wesley had several convictions, the law prohibited him from owning weapons, so he was immediately arrested. However, there was no evidence related to Angelica in his room. Thus, Wesley was charged with 3 crimes: illegal possession of a weapon, breaking into Cody's house, and tampering with evidence due to the jacket he had supposedly planted. He still insisted that he had nothing to do with his daughter's disappearance and was doing everything he could to find her. As a result, the court sentenced him to 20 years in prison, and the detectives continued to search for the young woman. They confiscated Wesley's work vehicle and found a shovel, tape, and dark gloves inside. However, the most interesting item was the GPS navigator, which they sent experts for analysis. The investigators wanted to know where Wesley had gone in the days after Angelica's disappearance. According to the data they received, on March 4th, Wesley had driven to a neighboring town, 90 kilometers away from Norfolk. His car had stayed in one place for 20 minutes before he drove back to work. Having arrived at the location on April 9th, the detective saw that his car was parked near an abandoned house in a remote area. After searching the area, they eventually found Angelica's body in a ditch not far from the building. She was covered with a piece of plywood, but even without it, it would have been extremely difficult to find her by chance, as the area around the house was overgrown and inaccessible. So no one could have stumbled upon her. The body was sent for a medical examination, and an unexpected statement awaited all participants in the process. According to the results, a dose of prohibited substances was found in the young woman's blood, which was 3 times the lethal dose for an average person. Angelica's family was in shock. The young woman didn't even drink alcohol, was actively involved in sports, and devoted almost all her time to studying. No one could believe that she was taking prohibited substances. Medical experts decided to conduct additional tests by analyzing the hair. It is possible to determine whether a person has taken narcotic drugs in the past, and this analysis showed that Angelica had never dealt with prohibited substances before. This made the version that she suddenly took a triple dose of her own free will practically impossible. In addition, someone buried her body in the ditch and covered it with a piece of plywood. Everything indicated that the young woman could have been given these substances against her will with the sole purpose of killing her and making it look like an accident. The detectives questioned Wesley again, who was already in prison at the time. The first question they asked him was what his work car was doing near the house where Angelica's body was found. The man's version was, to put it mildly, unconvincing. He said that he could have been set up and that he didn't go there himself. At the same time, he had previously said that no one except him had access to this car. Wesley even suggested that someone could have taken the navigator from his car, driven to that house, and returned the gadget back. Meanwhile, the police collected footage from various street cameras located along the way to this house, and they did indeed manage to find several recordings that showed that on that same day, Wesley was in the city where his daughter's body was found, driving his work car. Despite all this pointing to the man's involvement in the murder, the court needed more evidence. Therefore, the police continued to work on this case for several more years, trying to find irrefutable evidence. As a result, Wesley was charged with the murder of Angelica only at the end of 2018. The main court hearings began in January 2022, according to the prosecution's version of events. On March 2nd, Wesley arrived at the house where Angelica was located with the sole purpose of kidnapping her for the purpose of committing violent acts. He took her out of the house, carried out his plan, and gave her a triple dose of prohibited substances because he initially planned to make it look like an accident. During countless interrogations, the police repeatedly found that the man carefully thought out his versions and tried in every way to divert suspicion from himself. The prosecution managed to find a witness who supported their version, a person who sold Wesley the same prohibited drugs that Angelica died from. The court also heard that the police found Angelica's phone on the street and its location data was compared with Leslie's phone data. Since the young woman's disappearance, her smartphone was next to Wesley's smartphone, even when messages were sent from her mother's account. This indicated that it was Wesley who took Angelica's phone and tried to convince her mother that everything was okay with the young woman. The defendant's lawyers insisted that their client was innocent. According to their version, the young woman was depressed and decided to end her own life, and Wesley had nothing to do with it. This version did not explain why his car was near the place where her body was found or who buried her, covering her with a piece of plywood. All these arguments tried to explain either coincidences or attempts to frame Wesley. Interestingly, the man had said many times before that he did not believe in the overdose version and believed that Angelica was murdered. But for some reason, his opinion changed in court. It took the jury less than an hour to reach a verdict. Wesley was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The man said he would appeal the verdict and theoretically, he has a high enough chance of getting it overturned. As you may have already guessed, there is not a single material evidence against him. For example, no samples of his DNA were found on the victim's body, which would have been practically unquestionable evidence of guilt. The prosecution's main argument is the fact that Wesley's work car was actually located near the place where the young woman's body was later found. All other arguments are not serious evidence. Although just this person's past alone makes any of his words questionable. Considering that 10 years before the incident, he also kidnapped his wife and subjected her to violence, the prosecution's version seems more than convincing. But due to the lack of more significant evidence, lawyers may well challenge this verdict and achieve a new hearing. What do you think? Is Wesley guilty of murder, or does he have nothing to do with what happened? Share your opinion in the comments. A woman was found dead in her own apartment, and from the very beginning of the investigation the case was very strange. The only serious clue was a bite left by the attacker on the victim's body. It took the police over 20 years to finally uncover the horrifying truth, but such a turn of events caused a lot of dissatisfaction and criticism as no one expected such an outcome. Sher Rasmusen was born on February 7, 1957 in the state of Washington. She grew up in a large and friendly family with 2 sisters and loving parents. Later they moved to the city of Tucson, Arizona, where Sher attended the local school. She was an excellent student and even finished elementary school a year ahead of her peers. Sher completed the entire 7th grade program on summer vacation by herself. After graduating from high school in 1973, she enrolled in a California college where her older sister was already studying. In her first year, Sher decided to pursue a medical education and become a nurse, for which she had to take additional courses at another institution. After graduating from college in 1975, Sher decided to get a master's degree at the University of California, Los Angeles, and also worked there as a nurse to pay for her education. After receiving her master's degree at the age of 23, her father bought her an apartment in the suburbs of Los Angeles. But Sher did not want to live off her parents, so she wrote her father a check every month for the entire amount of the mortgage payments. She also got a job at a local hospital, heading the nursing department for caring for seriously ill people. In May 1984, when Sher was 27 years old, she met a man named John Rutan. They immediately hit it off and the couple started dating. John had a good education, worked as a computer engineer, and was a very intelligent young man. A year later the couple decided to get married and, after that, John moved into Sher's apartment. The newlyweds spent their honeymoon in Jamaica, after which they returned home to celebrate with Sher's family. It seemed that this couple was destined for a happy and carefree future. On February 24th of the following year, when John was getting ready for work as usual, Sher complained of feeling unwell and decided to stay home. She asked John to call her in a few hours. At around 7:20 a.m. John left for work. Closer to 10 a.m. John tried to reach her by phone, but she didn't answer. Half an hour later he tried again, but still no answer. So he called her workplace to check if she had gone to work, but Sher hadn't shown up at the hospital either. Her sister also tried to reach her, but without success. John returned home from work at around 6 p.m. and immediately noticed something strange. The garage door was open, even though he had closed it in the morning, and Sher's car was missing. Therefore, he first thought that she had gone somewhere. As he approached the garage, he saw a lot of broken glass and immediately discovered its source. There was a small balcony above the garage with a glass door which had been smashed. He entered the house through the garage and to his horror, found Sher there. She was lying on the floor, her body badly disfigured. John immediately called the police and detectives began to examine the crime scene. In all the rooms, there was complete chaos, broken vases, overturned furniture, scattered items. A bloody handprint was found on the wall next to the alarm button. Apparently the victim tried to reach it, but failed. In addition to extensive bruises and wounds, experts noticed a human bite mark on Sher's wrist. Apart from all of the above, the marks on her hands indicated that the attacker tied up the victim before untying her. The cause of death was 3 close-range gunshot wounds. Detectives found a blanket with bullet holes in the apartment and concluded that the attacker wrapped the gun in it to muffle the sound of the shots. Detectives immediately concluded that there was a prolonged struggle between the attacker and Sherry. This was evidenced by the amount of scattered and broken items throughout the apartment, as well as a bloody mark next to the alarm button. The lead investigator quickly concluded that they were dealing with a failed robbery. According to his opinion, at least 2 criminals broke into Sherry's apartment, but they didn't expect her to be home. A struggle ensued between them, and Sherry fought for her life until the end. Several facts supported the robbery version. Firstly, Sherry's car disappeared from the garage. Secondly, someone had placed the stereo equipment and player next to the staircase leading to the second floor. According to the police, the robbers wanted to take them and leave, but after the scuffle and murder, they fled the scene. However, there were some dubious moments in this version. Firstly, the police did not find any signs of forced entry. This meant that either Sherry let the criminals in herself or they had a key. Secondly, the perpetrators did not touch absolutely all the valuable items, including the jewelry box standing in plain sight. Detectives interviewed all of Sherry's neighbors, but it didn't yield any new leads. Some residents heard the sounds of a struggle, but not gunshots. They also didn't see anyone entering the woman's apartment. Experts took blood samples and fingerprints from the house, but they couldn't conduct DNA analysis in 1985. The lead investigator also took a piece of cotton and soaked it in the trace of the bite on Sherry's body. He hoped that the attacker's saliva could be left behind, and eventually experts could use this clue to catch the killer. After a thorough search of the apartment, detectives learned one interesting fact. It turned out that the criminals took only one thing: Sherry and John's marriage certificate. This was very strange and also raised suspicions about the man himself. But his alibi was unquestionable. John was at work until the evening, and he simply couldn't have committed this crime. Moreover, he himself told the police about the disappearance of this document. Detectives were unable to find an explanation for this strange fact. After a week and a half, they found Sherry's car in a parking lot 4 kilometers from her apartment. It was unlocked and the keys were in the ignition. Forensic experts tried to find fingerprints, but they were unsuccessful. Either the criminals only touched it with gloves on, or they wiped away all the fingerprints. 2 months after the murder that took place just a few hundred meters from Sherry's home, a robbery occurred. Detectives immediately found many similarities. 2 criminals broke into a stranger's apartment through the garage, threatened the owner with a gun, and stole stereo equipment. The lead investigator immediately thought that these 2 were behind the woman's murder, so the police tried to find them. From witness accounts, they created approximate composite sketches of the suspects and also learned that both men were Latino, but they were never found. However, investigators did not show much interest in getting to the truth, which constantly irritated Sherry's parents. Her father regularly went to the police station, inquired about the progress of the investigation, and asked the detectives to consider different versions. Once he even asked them to take a closer look at John's ex-girlfriend, Stephanie Lazarus, who was a police officer herself. Sherry had told her father several times that she was obsessed with John, but the investigators only laughed at this version. They told him to watch fewer detective shows. The thing was that Stephanie couldn't accept John's departure. Learning that he was going to marry another woman, she came to Sherry's workplace. Stephanie told her that their marriage was doomed and that she and John would be together again sooner or later. In addition, she said that John had slept with her already after becoming engaged to Sherry. Of course, after this visit, Sherry was deeply upset. Upon returning home, she told John what had happened, and he admitted that he had indeed slept with Stephanie. After she found out about his engagement, the young woman begged him to come over, spoke of her love, and urged him to return to her. But he said he loved Sherry and intended to marry her. Then Stephanie offered to sleep with him one last time, and John agreed. He apologized to Sherry and said it was a huge mistake on his part. The woman forgave him, and this incident with Stephanie gradually faded away. But the story didn't end there. Stephanie came to their home several times without warning under various pretexts. Once she came with a set of skis and announced that John promised to wax them for her. The next time she entered their apartment when the man was not at home. Sherry did not even hear how she entered the room and was shocked to see Stephanie in her living room. When asked what she was doing there, the woman said she came to talk to John. Sherry had a hard time convincing her to leave. Later, she even thought of going to the police about this incident, but did not. The woman was afraid that if she told about the harassment by their own employee, they would just laugh at her. She also wondered how Stephanie managed to enter the residential complex. It was surrounded by a high fence and a special pass was required to enter. Apparently, the woman used her police badge and the security let her in. As for Stephanie's apartment, there had to be a duplicate key. Otherwise, she simply could not have entered without breaking the lock. In addition to this, Sherry repeatedly noticed that someone was following her. Once she and John were sitting in a restaurant and the woman saw someone staring at them intently. As soon as she looked at this person, he immediately left. Sherry did not see his face because it was covered with a hood. It could be Stephanie. The victim's father told detectives about all these incidents, but they did not attach any importance to his words. They were sure that the murder was committed by the two Mexicans who robbed an apartment near Sherry's home. 3 months after the murder, something interesting happened. Some documents from Sherry's case disappeared from the police station. Among them were records of detectives about the progress of the investigation. They had to record almost every step related to the investigation of this crime. But at one point, the police simply could not find these journals. However, there were no important leads there anyway. Since then, the case has been hanging for years. Detectives did not show much desire to look for new leads despite constant pressure from Sherry's parents. 8 months after the murder, Sherry's father offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help find the perpetrator. A year later, he held a press conference where he again promised a reward for information, but in both cases, it yielded no results. 7 years later, the lead investigator on the case retired. The victim's father decided to meet with his successor, hoping that he would take his job more seriously. Additionally, it was 1993 and DNA analysis technology was already being actively used by the police to solve crimes. Sherry's father asked the detective to perform such an analysis and even offered to fully pay for it. However, the detective stated that it was pointless since they did not have a single suspect with whom to compare the obtained DNA profile. Meanwhile, John started a new family, but at some point he reunited with Stephanie. They planned to go to Hawaii together, but something unusual happened before that. The man called the detective and asked if they had any new evidence indicating Stephanie's involvement in the murder. Apparently, he himself suspected that the woman might have done something like that. However, all these years, he was afraid to talk about it, although this did not prevent him from sleeping with her again. As for Stephanie herself, she was quickly climbing the career ladder in the police department. She received higher ranks, twice became Detective of the Year, and had an impeccable reputation. She also married another police officer, but this did not prevent her from regularly sleeping with John to work on unsolved murders. They were given Sherry's case along with thousands of similar cases, and the detectives began sorting through them gradually. They briefly studied each case, trying to understand which ones had the greatest chance of being solved. For example, murders without any clues were pushed to the end of the queue, and cases with DNA samples of possible suspects were marked as the most promising. Sherry's murder made it onto this list because among the evidence was a piece of cotton that could have contained the perpetrator's saliva left behind after a bite. 2 years later, detectives picked up the case and sent all available evidence to the laboratory. Due to high demand, they had to wait almost 2 years for the results until January 2005. Among the evidence were nail fragments and blood samples from the apartment. All of them contained only Sherry's DNA, and the forensic scientists only had to study the sample from the bite mark on her body. The problem was that they couldn't find the vial with this evidence for a whole day, until they finally discovered it by the wall of a large refrigerator. After studying the sample, experts found foreign DNA belonging to an unknown woman. This profile was immediately run through the FBI database, but it wasn't there. Detectives speculated that this woman could have committed the robbery with another criminal, or 2 female robbers could have broken into Sherry's apartment. The investigators still believed that the murder occurred during a robbery, therefore they didn't consider any other versions after they failed to find any new leads in this direction. The case was put on hold. This continued until February 2009 when a new detective took up Sherry's case, began studying the materials left by other investigators. Seeing that DNA from another woman was found at the bite mark on the victim's body, he questioned the robbery version. Detectives considered that the motives for this crime could be completely different, so they decided to compile a list of all the women who could potentially be related to Sherry's murder. As a result, they managed to collect 5 names. Among them was Stephanie, the victim's colleague at work, and 3 other young women. The detectives initially doubted Stephanie's involvement, considering her reputation and successful career in the police. For this reason, he first decided to check the other suspects. Together with other investigators, they fairly quickly concluded that 3 women from this list had no connection to Sherry's death. They lacked motives and had alibis. After that, they began to investigate the nurse who worked with Sherry. The case file stated that they had rather tense relations, and the police secretly obtained a sample of her DNA from the trash he threw away. Experts extracted the profile and found that it didn't match the saliva found at the bite mark location. Thus, the detectives had only one suspect left: Stephanie. He and several colleagues agreed to keep this information secret until they could obtain solid evidence or disprove this theory. None of them wanted to accuse a police officer with an impeccable reputation of murder, and Stephanie could easily ruin their careers using her connections. They began secretly gathering information on her, trying to find any connection to the murder. Interestingly, the woman worked in the same building on the same floor as them. The investigators had to take many precautions and not even mention her name in their notes. Soon the detectives discovered the first interesting fact. During the years of the murder, Stephanie owned a .38 caliber revolver, the same type of gun that was used to shoot Sherry. They also learned that the victim had repeatedly complained about strange and even aggressive behavior from Stephanie in her uniform, and said rude things to her seemed suspicious. Even more suspicion was added by the fact that Stephanie had broken into Sherry's gated community and even into her apartment several times. After analyzing the reports and photos from the crime scene, the detectives concluded that the possible robbery seemed staged. Nothing was taken from the apartment, not even the valuable items that were prominently displayed. But instead, only a player and stereo were taken away. Moreover, the shooter had to be well-versed in how the gun worked. In extreme conditions, he was able to wrap the gun barrel with a blanket in such a way that the neighbors did not hear a single shot. It is unlikely that a low-level thief of players could possess such skills, but a trained and experienced police officer could. Another fact indicating Stephanie's involvement was a stolen marriage registration certificate found in her apartment. Why would some random burglars look for this document and take it with them, leaving a whole box of jewelry behind? But for Stephanie, it could have had a significant symbolic value. Perhaps killing Sherry was not enough for her, or she had planned to break into her apartment only for this document, but the woman caught her in the act. In the end, the detective learned that 2 weeks after the murder, Stephanie came to the police station and filed a report of theft. According to this information, someone had broken into her car, which was left near the pier, and stolen several items, including a sports bag, clothes, videotapes, and a .38 caliber revolver. Given all the facts presented, the moment with the gun seemed very suspicious. Detectives suspected that she intentionally got rid of the weapon, disguising it as a theft. Furthermore, she filed a report at a different police station where nobody knew her, which seemed very strange since her colleagues would have taken the case with the utmost responsibility. As a result, the detectives decided to obtain a DNA sample from Stephanie. Several officers undercover followed her for a week until they finally had the opportunity to get it. On May 28, 2009, Stephanie and her stepdaughter stopped at a cafe for a snack. As soon as they left, the officers took the glass she drank from and sent it to the lab. The next day, the result was ready. A full match. Despite the many factors pointing to Stephanie's involvement, the detectives were still shocked. It was hard for them to believe that a high-ranking and respected police officer was connected to the murder. But the DNA results were indisputable. However, at that moment, they did not have time for these thoughts and investigators began developing a plan to arrest her. None of them wanted to do this in the middle of the police station in front of hundreds of officers. Moreover, Stephanie had extensive connections and the detectives decided to lure her away from prying eyes. The chief of the Los Angeles Police Department was unofficially informed that one of his subordinates was suspected of the murder. The chief ordered the detectives not to approach Stephanie while she had her service or personal weapon with her. He also considered the idea of arresting her in her own home risky since she lived with her husband and stepdaughter. The detectives began to think about how to get the person who outranked them to surrender their weapon. And soon they had an excellent idea. In the basement of the police department, there were holding cells designed for temporary detention of criminals. So anyone entering there had to surrender their weapon. To lure her there, a legend was created. Stephanie had extensive experience working in the department that dealt with art thefts. Therefore, on June 5, 2009, two detectives with hidden microphones approached her and asked for help. They said they had arrested a suspect who may have some information about stolen paintings. The detectives admitted that they were not familiar with all the details and needed the help of an experienced professional. Stephanie agreed and went with them to the basement where the suspect was supposed to be held. After the woman surrendered her weapon, they went to the interrogation room, but there was no suspect there. Instead, the detectives gradually and very carefully laid out the cards on the table, asking Stephanie questions about Sherry's murder. At first, they simply said that they needed to ask her a few questions about an old case related to her ex-boyfriend. Over the course of an hour, they smoothly led the dialogue to a discussion of the murder itself, but Stephanie said that she hardly remembered Sherry as it was all a long time ago. Finally, the detectives announced that they had obtained the killer's DNA and asked Stephanie to provide her DNA sample for comparison. At that point, the woman immediately said that she was not going to give her DNA, refused to talk further without a lawyer, and decided to leave. The detectives let her go, but several policemen with handcuffs were waiting for Stephanie at the end of the corridor. 23 years after the murder, the woman was arrested. Considering Stephanie's vast police experience, all attempts to talk to her during interrogations led to no results. She knew the situation perfectly. There was DNA evidence against her, found at the bite mark on the victim's body, and it was extremely difficult to dispute this evidence. Nevertheless, she denied her involvement and insisted on her innocence. As a result, the detectives had no choice but to prepare documents for the transfer to court. Over the next few years, Stephanie was held in a women's prison until the first hearings began in 2012. It took the police 3 years to basically rebuild the case from scratch. Because their predecessors blindly believed in a failed robbery, it was necessary to redo all the materials and focus specifically on Stephanie. After trial, the woman continued to insist on her innocence. Her lawyer questioned the DNA test results and also pointed out that there were no suspicions against Stephanie during the initial investigation. But all these arguments turned out to be completely unconvincing. The prosecution believed that on that day, Stephanie waited for John to leave for work and entered Sherry's apartment. She went upstairs, shot Sherry once, but Sherry managed to resist and a struggle ensued, which moved downstairs. Ultimately, Stephanie killed her, staged a riot in the apartment, creating an illusion of a burglary. She then found a marriage certificate and left the scene. After her arrest, detectives discovered that Stephanie had boasted to colleagues about her lock-picking set, and they found several books on how to pick locks in her home. This could explain how she entered the apartment without leaving any traces of a break-in. A lock of not the best quality can be picked with lock picks so that no expert will notice any traces. The trial ended on March 8, 2012. The jury found Stephanie guilty of murder. She received a sentence ranging from 27 years to life in prison, as well as an additional 2 years for using a service weapon. The judge deducted 1,000 days from her sentence, citing the time spent behind bars awaiting trial and her good behavior. Sherry's parents tried to sue the detectives who originally worked the case, despite the fact that the victim's father had been telling them to look at Stephanie from the very beginning. They ignored his words. This raises a reasonable question. Were they deliberately covering up their colleague, or did they really not believe in her involvement? In the first case, it would have been a serious crime. And in the second case, it would have been simple negligence and ignoring significant facts. Unfortunately, the statute of limitations had expired in this case, and the court refused to prosecute these police officers. As for Stephanie, she filed an appeal immediately after the trial, but it was quickly rejected. She still denies her guilt while behind bars. At present, she's 62 years old and can file a petition for early release only in 2039. Sherry's ex-husband, John, lost interest in investigating her murder. Almost immediately after it happened, he started a new family, slept with Stephanie for a while, and later moved to another city. Detectives questioned his involvement, but this version seems unlikely. Most likely, he did not know about his ex-wife's plans. Thus, this case could have been gathering dust in archives to this day if it hadn't fallen into the hands of professional detectives. Everyone who worked on it before refused to even consider the version of their colleagues' involvement. Share your opinion about this story in the comments, and don't forget to give a like if you enjoyed the video.